The breach alarm cut through the wind before Del Marrow got the shed door latched, and she knew from the pitch of it that the storm shield perimeter had already failed. She threw her weight against the door, boots skidding in the frozen sedge, and drove the outer bar home. The alarm was a Sethvin sound, 3 descending tones, hollow as a struck pipe, meant to carry across the whole reclamation grid, and it meant the wall of moving air the wardens called the whitening had come over the ridge 50 kilometers early and torn the shield line open like wet paper. Anything alive on the flats had until the cold caught up with it. That was maybe an hour if the wind held its current speed. It was not going to hold its current speed. Del stood with her back against the shed and let herself breathe once. The thermal core inside the shed thumped under her spine, steady, warm, the only heat for 30 kilometers in any direction now that the grid was down. She could feel it through the plating. So could everything else out there in the dark. Her handset crackled. Marrow, Marrow, are you sealed? Not a question the way Pell said it, more a prayer he was trying to disguise as procedure. Sealed, she said. Core's up, I'm fine. You are not fine, you are on the seam. Junior Warden Pell's voice climbed. Behind it she could hear the relay station's own alarms, a whole choir of Sethvin panic. The shield went at the seam. Both ranges are open. Do you understand what that means? Both ranges at once. I understand what a seam is, Pell. I live on it. That was the thing the Sethvin never quite forgave her for. The Marrow holding sat in the one place on the whole reclamation contract nobody sane would put a structure. The narrow tongue of dead ground where the North Flats met the Ridge country, where 2 hunting ranges pressed against each other along a line the wardens had spent 9 years and a great deal of money keeping the local predators from crossing. The Dreno held the north. The Korvach held the ridges. They had been killing each other along that seam since long before the Sethvin arrived, and the shield line ran right down the middle of it, and Del's holding sat on top of the shield line because that was where the reclamation soil needed working, and no Sethvin would set foot there. So they had given the job to the human, cheaper than a wall. I'm pulling the Culdrones back to the depot, Pell said. There's nothing they can do in this wind. Marshal's orders. Everyone's coming in off the flats. You stay inside, you keep the core warm, you don't open that door for anything. A pause and then, smaller, please. Wasn't planning on a walk, Del said, and killed the channel before he could make her promise twice. Then she stood in the dark of the shed with the core thumping and the wind starting its long climb toward a scream, and she waited to find out what was going to come to her door. She did not have to wait long. The first she knew of them was the light changing. She had a single lamp burning low over the workbench, and the shed had one narrow window of scratched poly set into the door at eye height, and something moved across that window and blotted the storm glow and was gone. Then it came back. Then there were 2 of them, low and gray and streaming past the poly like smoke, and a third, and Del set down the wrench she had picked up without deciding to pick it up and went and stood at the window and looked out into the white. Dreno. They had come off the North Flats ahead of the cold, a dozen of them at least, gray backs and long legs, and the particular loping economy of animals that had run a long way and were not done running. They did not like the shed. She could see it in the way they circled it, heads low, giving the metal walls a wide berth, snapping at each other, milling. The wind was killing them by degrees, and the only warm thing on the flats was a human box that smelled of human and machine, and every instinct they had told them to keep away from it, and the cold told them they were going to die out there, and the 2 facts ground against each other in the circling. Del knew the pack. Not by pretending it was tame. It was not tame. It had never been tame, but the way you know the weather that lives over your house. She had watched this pack from her window for 3 seasons. She knew the big scarred female who ran it, gray going white at the muzzle, an old wound puckering one shoulder into a knot. The gray mother, Del called her, though never out loud where a warden could hear, because the wardens did not like it when the human named the things they were paid to exterminate. And she knew the yearling. He was near the back of the mill, favoring a foreleg, and Dell knew the limp because she was the reason he still had the leg. Last spring the wardens had run a coal drive along the seam and strung boundary wire, and a half-grown Dreno had gotten a hind foot into it and torn himself bloody trying to pull free, and Dell had gone out at dusk with cutters and a bad idea and freed him while the pack watched her from 40 meters off, and she had not reported it, and the wardens had marked the drive a success and gone home. The yearling had lived. He had a white blaze on his chest shaped like a splash. She called him Scrap. He was going to die tonight if she did nothing. So were the rest of them. The cold was coming. Dell looked at the pack circling her shed in the failing light and did the arithmetic she was not supposed to do. The shed was 6 meters by 4. The core would hold the heat as long as the door stayed shut. If she opened the door, she let the storm in, and she let the pack in, and she put herself in a metal box with a dozen apex predators who had every reason to see her as either a threat or a meal. If she did not open the door, she listened to them die against her walls all night. She had known which way it was going to go from the moment the light changed. She was just letting herself have the 10 seconds it took to be afraid of it. "All right," she said to nobody, to the core, to the storm. "All right." She did not fling the door wide. She was calm, not stupid. She unbarred it and let it come open a hand's width against the wind, and the storm shoved a knife of cold into the shed, and she stood back from the gap with her hands loose and open at her sides and made herself into the least interesting thing in the world. For a long moment nothing happened. The wind screamed in the gap. The lamp guttered. Then a gray shape filled the window and dropped away, and the gray mother put her scarred face into the gap of the door and looked at Dell across 2 meters of warm air, and Dell looked back and did not move and did not speak and did not smile, because a bared row of teeth was a challenge to a Dreno, and she knew that too. The gray mother's nose worked. She took the human in, the smell of her, the stillness of her, the warmth pouring off the core behind her. Somewhere in the old animal calculation behind those amber eyes, Dell knew, was the wire, and the yearling, and the dusk when this same small biped had come out with a tool and cut a young one loose and gone away again and never come back for a price. Whether that memory counted for anything Dell could not know. She only knew that the gray mother held there in the doorway a long time, deciding, while the cold killed her pack behind her. Then the old female turned her head and made a sound Dell had never heard a Dreno make, low and short, almost a cough, and stepped through the door into the shed. The rest came after her in a gray flood. They poured in around Dell's legs, 12, 14, brushing her, ignoring her, a river of cold fur and hard muscle and the reek of the flats, and she stood dead still in the middle of it with her heart going like a hammer and let them go by. They packed into the warm dark, shaking, pressing against the core wall and against each other, and the shed that had felt too big for one human was suddenly full of breathing. Dell got a hand on the door and hauled it shut against the wind and dropped the bar, and the scream of the storm fell to a moan, and she turned around in the sudden hot dark and found herself sharing a 6x4 box with a Dreno pack. Nobody killed her, that was the first thing. She stood with her back to the door and catalogued it. Nobody killed her, nobody circled her. The pack had come in and taken the far wall and left her the door, and that was not tolerance exactly, and it was not tameness, and she did not have a word for what it was. The gray mother had lain down against the core with her flank heaving and her eyes half shut and her muzzle pointed at Dell, and every so often those eyes opened and found the human and closed again, and that was the whole of it. The human was accounted for. The human was warmth that walked. The human was not to be touched. Scrap came to her. He was the only one. He limped up out of the gray mass with his splash-blazed chest and put his nose against her knee, once, and Dell made herself breathe. And then she did the thing she had wanted to do for a year and was never able to, which was to lay her flat hand very slowly on the top of his hard young head, between the ears, where the fur was still soft. He leaned into it. Across the shed the gray mother watched and did not rise, and did not object, and Dell understood that she had just been permitted something. "Hey, Scrap," she said very quietly. "Look at you big now." That was when the second smell came under the door. She felt the change before she understood it. The whole pack came up off the floor at once, not toward her, away from her, toward the door, hackles standing, a sound rising out of 14 throats that was not a growl so much as the sky before a growl. The gray mother was on her feet with her scarred lip peeled back and her weight low. Scrap had gone from a lean of trust to a rigid line of fury against Dell's leg in the space of a breath. Every eye in the shed was fixed on the door, and past the door on the storm, and on the thing coming through the storm. Dell knew the smell too, though her human nose only got the edge of what theirs were getting. Musk and dust and cold stone. Rich smell. "Corvetch?" "Oh no," she said. "No, no, no." Because there was only one warm box on the flats, and the Drano were not the only thing dying in the whitening, and the cold did not care about the 9 years and the shield line and the war along the seam. The cold drove everything to the same door, and the thing about the door was that it was hers. The handset on the bench lit up. Pell. She did not answer it. She could not take her eyes off the Drano, who were bunching now, the whole pack drawing back toward the far wall and the core, leaving a killing ground of empty floor between themselves and the door. The door Dell stood in front of, and she understood with a cold that had nothing to do with the storm exactly what was about to happen in her shed, and exactly where she was standing when it happened. The first Corvetch hit the door. Not clawing, testing. A weight, a scrape, a heavy shoulder against the plating there and gone. Then the window darkened and Dell was looking at a Corvetch face a hand's breadth from her own through the scratched poly, and it was nothing like a Drano. It was low and broad and armored across the skull, with a mane of stiff barbed quills lying flat along its neck, and a pair of flat gold eyes with no warmth in them at all. And it was looking not at the pack behind her but at her, at the human in the doorway, weighing her the way the gray mother had weighed her. Except that the gray mother had had a reason to remember mercy, and this thing had none that Dell knew of. Except that it did. She had almost forgotten, because she had spent 2 seasons trying to. Last winter, before Scrap, before the wire, a Corvetch had come off the ridges with a warden's barbrand buried in the meat of its shoulder, festering, and it had lain up in the lee of Dell's shed for 3 days too sick to hunt, and Dell had done a stupid thing then too. She had put a dish of water and the guts of a slaughtered feeder hog out at the corner of the shed each dusk, moving slow, never closer than she had to, and on the 3rd dusk she had gotten close enough with a long pair of pliers and a great deal of luck to close them on the barb where it stood proud of the wound and pull it, in one motion, and run. The Corvetch had screamed and struck and missed her by the width of the wound it was too weak to press, and then it had eaten the hog and drunk the water and on the 4th dusk been gone. She had never known if it lived. The flat gold eye at the window had a scar under it, a pale seam through the dark fur where a warden's barb had once festered and been drawn. "You're the one," Dell breathed. "You lived." The Ridge Queen, because that was what she was. Dell could see it now in the size of her, and the set of her, and the way the storm itself seemed to break around her shoulders, pulled her broad head back from the window, and the door boomed as her weight came off it. And for one heartbeat Dell thought she had chosen to take her chances in the cold rather than come into a box that stank of Drano. Then the Corvetch put her killing claw into the door seam and began, methodically, to lever it open. Behind Dell, the Drano pack made the sound of a landslide starting. And Del Marrow, 26 years old, a soil tech from a colony ship 300 light-years gone, alone on the worst piece of ground on the contract with a storm eating the world and 2 hereditary enemies about to meet in her 6x4 shed with her body as the border between them, did the only thing she had ever been any good at. She stayed calm. "Stop," she said, not loud. She put a flat hand back toward the Drano without looking at them, palm out, the way you calm a spooked animal, and with her other hand she reached and unbarred the door and the whole shed seemed to inhale. "Just everybody stop. There's room." There was not room, that was the joke of it. There was nowhere near room. But she got the bar up and stepped back, one step two, putting herself against the core wall to the side, out of the killing ground, taking herself out of the space between the two packs so that neither could read her as belonging to the other, and she pulled the door open a hand's width, and the Ridge Queen came through it low and fast and terrible, and the Dreno surged, and Del Marrow stood against the warm wall of her own shed and watched a war try to start 6 feet from her boots. It did not start. That was the thing she would never be able to explain to the wardens afterward, the thing that went into their range law under a name none of them had yet imagined. It did not start. The Ridge Queen came in and stopped. Not because the Dreno stopped her. They were bunched and screaming and ready, and there were 14 of them, and she was one, with maybe 5 more of her kind still out in the storm behind her. But because she came in low and fast and terrible and found the human against the wall calm, still, one hand raised, saying nothing now, and something in the animal arithmetic seized. The Corvette stopped in the center of the killing ground with Dreno to her left and Dreno to her right and the human at her back, and she did not go for a throat, and the Dreno did not close, and for the length of 3 of Del's slamming heartbeats the whole shed held in a balance so fine that the guttering of the lamp could have tipped it. Del reached over without any sudden motion and turned up the lamp. Light came into the shed, yellow and warm and steady, and fell on the human standing quiet against the wall of her own house, and on the 2 packs frozen in the act of deciding whether to die, and Del looked from the gray mother to the Ridge Queen and back, and said, in the flat practical voice she used for talking to her core and her soil and herself, the voice of the one creature in the room who was not afraid. Not in here, you hear me? Not in my house. Then she reached up onto the shelf above the core, where the battered tin kettle sat that she boiled her water in every morning of her life, and she filled it from the wall tap, and she set it down on the hot plate of the core, and she turned the plate on, and in the ringing silence of the shed the kettle began, very quietly, to tick as its metal warmed. The gray mother lay down. She did it slowly, watching the Ridge Queen the whole time, but she did it, folded her scarred old body down against the core wall and put her muzzle on her paws and did not take her eyes off her enemy, but lay down, in her enemy's presence, 6 feet away, because the human had turned up the light and set the kettle on and told them no. The pack followed her down by 1s and 2s, a grudging, bristling settling, teeth still showing but down. And the Ridge Queen, alone in the middle of the floor, looked at the lying down Dreno and at the human against the wall and at the kettle beginning to tick on the core, and after a long, long moment, she backed, not turned, backed, keeping her face to the pack into the empty corner by the door, the coldest corner, the one nearest the storm, and lowered her heavy body to the floor there, and laid her killing claw flat against the plating and became still. Behind her, one by one, the rest of the Ridge pack slipped in through the gap in the door out of the dying night, and found their queen holding a corner in the house of the enemy and lay down around her, and the last one in bumped the door with its haunch and swung it shut, and the storm was outside, and they were inside, all of them together, and nobody was dead. Del let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for a year. The handset was still blinking on the bench. She crossed the shed to it, slowly, so slowly, threading the 2-meter no-man's land between the packs while 30 predator eyes tracked her, and not one body moved, and she picked it up and thumbed it live and put it to her ear, and Junior Warden Pell's voice came out of it thin and frantic and small. Marrow, respond, for the love of the deep. Marrow, the seam sensors are lighting up. We're reading 2 full pack signatures converging on your position. Do you hear me? Both ranges, both packs. They're right on top of you, Marrow. Del, are you alive? Del looked around her shed, at the gray mother by the core with her chin on her paws, at the Ridge Queen in the cold corner with her claw flat on the floor, at Scrap, who had crept back to the wall beside her and pressed his splash-blazed shoulder against her shin, at the kettle beginning, faintly, to sing. Yeah, Pell, she said, I'm alive. I've got a full house. Tell the marshal to leave us be till morning. You've got a— What does that mean, a full house, Marrow? What are you? It means don't send anybody, Dell said. Whatever your sensors are telling you, don't send anybody, don't fly anything over, don't do anything but let it be till the storm breaks. I mean it, Pell. Everything out here is fine as long as everybody stays exactly where they are. She looked at the two alphas. Neither had moved. The kettle ticked toward a boil. Just let it be quiet, she said. It only works if it stays quiet. She set the handset down before he could argue, and she turned it face down so the blinking would stop. And she went and sat on the floor with her back against the warm core, in the narrow safe strip that was hers, between the gray mother and the ridge queen. In the eye of the worst storm the seam had seen in a decade, and she waited for the water to boil. At the relay station 40 kilometers up the grid, Junior Warden Pell stood over a console that would not stop screaming and tried to decide whether he had just heard a human being die. He was young, for a warden 3 seasons out of the depot, still shedding the soft plates of adolescence along his forearms, the chitin there paler than a grown Sethvin's and prone to itch in the cold. He had drawn the seam relay because nobody senior wanted it, because the seam relay meant sitting in a tin can at the edge of the exclusion zone listening to the sensors count predators, and because the seam relay came with the human, and nobody senior wanted the human either. The human unsettled them. She lived where a Sethvin would die, and she talked about the Dreno the way other people talked about weather, and she had a way of going quiet that made the plates along your spine want to lift. Pell had decided privately, over 3 seasons of relaying her supply requests and her soil reports and her flat refusals of the warden's repeated offers to relocate her to somewhere sane, that he liked her. He was not sure this was allowed. He was fairly sure right now that it did not matter, because the board in front of him showed 2 pack signatures stacked on a single grid point, her grid point, and the way the sensors read it there should already be a great deal of blood on the floor of her shed. Except she had answered the handset, and she had sounded bored. I've got a full house. Tell the marshal to leave us be till morning. Pell did not understand what he had heard. He replayed it 3 times. Full house. Don't send anybody. It only works if it stays quiet. He looked at the 2 pack signatures sitting on top of each other on his board, Dreno North and Corvet's Ridge. The 2 signatures the whole shield line existed to keep apart, occupying the same 3 square meters of the coldest night in a decade, and not moving, and not separating, and not— this was the part his instruments insisted on and his mind refused— not fighting. He should log it. He should log it and send it up the line, because that was procedure, because 2 pack signatures merging was exactly the kind of anomaly the seam relay existed to catch, and a good warden logged the anomaly and let the ones with rank decide what it meant. He looked at the board for a long time. Then he did something a good warden did not do. He wrote it up as a sensor fault. He told himself it was because the readings were impossible and impossible readings were probably false. He told himself the wind was fouling the seam sensors, which was true. They were rated poorly for shear, and the whitening was off the top of the shear scale. He told himself a dozen sensible things. Underneath all of them was the memory of the human's voice saying, "Let it be quiet. It only works if it stays quiet," and a young warden's animal certainty that, if he sent the truth up the line to the depot on the night of the worst storm in a decade, someone with rank would do something loud. So he logged a fault, and he flagged the seam sensors for maintenance, and he sat alone in his tin can at the edge of the exclusion zone with the storm howling over him, and he kept her channel open, low, just under his hearing, so that if the sound of it changed he would know. For a long time it did not change. For a long time there was only the storm and the tick of a kettle, and very faintly, a human voice humming something with no tune he knew. Inside the shed, the water had boiled, and Dell had made herself a cup of the bitter Sethvin ration tea she had learned to stomach, and she had not been killed while doing it, and she was beginning to believe she might live to morning. The truce was not peace. She understood that. She sat with her back to the core in the strip of floor that was hers, and she watched the two packs hold their line across her house, and she catalogued the 1,000 small ways it was not peace. The Dreno lay along the warm core wall, and the Korvach held the cold corner by the door, and between them ran 2 meters of empty floor that neither would cross, and every animal in the shed knew exactly where that line was and lay pointed at it, and did not sleep. The Grey Mother did not sleep. The Ridge Queen did not sleep. Their people took turns, one eye at a time, but the 2 old females lay awake and watched each other across the human's floor all night, and the human sat between them and drank her tea and she slowly understood, the reason the line held. She tested it once by accident. She shifted to ease a cramping leg and stood, and the instant she was on her feet both packs came up off the floor in a single rustling surge, hackles rising, the low sky before a growl swelling out of 30 throats, and she froze and put her hands out, palms down, and said, "Easy, easy, sitting down. Look." Sitting down, and lowered herself back to the floor, and by the time she was down the surge had gone out of the room like a tide, and both packs settled again, watching her, and she understood something that turned her cold under the warmth of the core. They were not watching each other, not first, they were watching her. The line did not hold because the Dreno feared the Korvach, or the Korvach feared the Dreno. Those two had feared each other for 1,000 years, and it had never once stopped them from killing. The line held because both packs had, in the impossible arithmetic of the night, agreed on exactly one thing, that the small warm biped against the core was not prey, was not rival, was not either of their kinds, and was somehow, in a way none of them had a place for, above them. She held the ground. And you did not spill blood on ground that was held, not while the one who held it was watching, because to do so was to challenge the holder, and neither pack, alone, half-frozen, at the edge of the killing cold, was ready to challenge a thing that could turn up the light and set the kettle on and tell 2 apex packs to lie down and be obeyed. Dell sat very still with this knowledge and drank her tea and thought, with the flat gallows humor that was the only kind she had. Well, don't stand up then. Around the middle of the night, the cub came. Dell heard it before she understood it, a thin, reedy cry under the storm, the wrong pitch for the wind coming from outside and low. The Ridge Queen heard it too, and did a thing Dell had not seen her do all night. She lifted her broad head fully off the floor and turned it toward the door and made a sound back, a churring rumble, and out in the storm the thin cry came again, closer, desperate, and the Queen was on her feet. It cost the truce. The instant the Ridge Queen rose, the Dreno rose, the whole gray wall of them coming up snarling, reading a standing Korvach as an opening move, and the Ridge pack rose to meet them, and the 2 meters of empty floor shrank to nothing as the packs bunched, and Dell was already moving, because the Queen was at the door working the latch with her killing claw, and if that door came open onto a room this close to breaking, everyone in it died. No, hey, Dell got herself into the killing ground, into the 2 meters, into the one place in the shed she had spent all night staying out of, and both packs recoiled from her the way water recoils from a dropped stone, and in the sudden half-meter of clearance her body bought she got to the door and put her own hand on the latch over the Queen's claw and said, fast and low, let me. There's a baby out there, yeah. Let me, I'm faster with the door, let me. The Ridge Queen could have opened her throat. Dell's hand was on the latch a hand's breadth from that scarred, gold-eyed face, and the killing claw was right there, and the Queen was wild with the sound of her young dying in the cold, and for one white instant Dell felt the whole weight of the animal's fear and fury swing toward her. And then the Queen pulled her claw back off the latch and dropped her head once, a short hard nod, seating it, and Dell hauled the door open a hand's width into the storm. The cub fell through it. Half-frozen, mewling, no bigger than Dell's 2 fists, a scrap of dark wet fur with a barbed baby mane plastered flat and gold eyes squeezed shut, and it landed on the cold plating and the Queen was on it in an instant, nosing it, gathering it, and Dell slammed the door and dropped the bar and turned around with her back against it, breathing hard, to face a room that had come one heartbeat from war. Both packs were up, both packs were bunched, the 2 meters was gone. The gray mother stood rigid with her scarred lip peeled and her eyes on the queen, and the queen stood over her found cub with her mane fully erect for the first time all night, 40 barbs standing off her neck like a crown of knives, and the whole room was a hair from the thing the storm had been trying to make happen all night, and it was going to happen now over a cub, and Dell was standing in the middle of it. She did the only thing left. She went and sat down, not against the wall in the middle. In the killing ground, in the 2-meter line, in the exact center of the floor between the 2 packs, cross-legged, defenseless, her back to neither of them. And she put her cooling cup of tea down on the plating in front of her, and she picked up her humming again, the tuneless old work song her mother had hummed over the hydroponics on the ship 300 light-years and 26 years gone, and she waited. It was the most frightened she had ever been in her life. She did not let it into her hands. For a long moment, the room stayed on its knife edge. Then the gray mother's ears flicked toward the human sitting impossibly in the middle of the floor, humming, unarmed, unafraid, occupying the line that both packs had agreed all night not to cross, and holding it physically with her own soft body, and something went out of the old Dreno's shoulders. She did not lie down, but she stopped leaning forward. And the queen, over her cub, saw the Dreno stop, and slowly, barb by barb, let her terrible mane go down, and gathered her cub against her chest and backed again into the cold corner, and the 2 meters opened up again around the human sitting in the middle of it, and the night went on, and nobody died. Dell did not move from the center of the floor for a long time after that. It seemed important. As long as she sat in the line, there was no line to cross. There was only the human, and you did not cross the human. She hummed until her throat was dry, and then she hummed some more, and across the shed the Corvet's cub stopped shivering against its mother's warmth. And once, only once, the Ridge Queen looked at the human sitting between the packs and made a low sound that was not a growl and was not a threat, and had, Dell thought, if an animal could have such a thing, something almost like the shape of a question in it. Yeah, Dell said to her softly, across the floor, across the war, across 9 years of shield line and 1,000 years of blood. Yeah, I've got you. Everybody's got everybody tonight. Just till morning. 40 kilometers away, in a heated office at the depot that had never in its existence dropped below a comfortable temperature, Warden-Captain Vrel was reviewing the night's grid logs and finding one of them very interesting indeed. Vrel was not a cruel Sethvan. He would have been genuinely wounded to hear himself described that way, and he would have had arguments ready. He was an efficient Sethvan, a Sethvan of budgets and timelines and closed contracts, and he had come to the seam reclamation 2 years ago to fix a project that was 9 years behind schedule and bleeding money. And he had determined in his first month that the single largest reason the project was behind schedule and bleeding money was the predators. The Dreno and the Corvet had killed 11 wardens in 9 years. They had destroyed cull drones, breached shield lines, made whole grid sectors unworkable, and forced the contract to maintain the single most expensive piece of infrastructure on the books, the seam shield, for the sole purpose of keeping 2 populations of animals from doing to each other what would have solved the entire problem, if only they would do it somewhere the reclamation did not need the ground. Vrel had spent 2 years trying to get authorization for a coordinated cull of both packs and had been refused every time, on cost, on optics, on the objections of the exobiology office, on the simple logistical truth that you could not bring both packs to ground at once because they were never in the same place at once. The whole point of them was that they kept apart. And now he was looking at a sensor log, flagged as a fault by a junior warden at the seam relay, that showed both pack signatures stacked on a single grid point and holding there for 6 hours. Both packs, 1 point not moving. Vrel read the flag twice, sensor fault. He pulled the raw feed under it and looked at the signature strengths and the thermal bleed and the position, and he was an efficient Sethvan and not a stupid one, and it took him about 90 seconds to understand that it was not a sensor fault at all. The grid point was the marrow holding. The thermal bleed was the human's core, and the two pack signatures were not merged because a sensor was broken. They were merged because both packs had gone to ground in the one heated structure on the seam, driven there by the storm, and they were sitting on top of each other in a 6x4 shed, all of them together in one place at one time, for the first and possibly the only time in the history of the contract. Warden-Captain Osip Vrel sat back from his console, and along his spine, in a motion he would have been ashamed to have witnessed, the plates lifted very slightly with something that was not fear. It was opportunity. He did the arithmetic Dell had done, from the other end of it. One structure, both packs, sealed in by a storm that would not break until dawn and that grounded every flyer and blinded every long sensor, so that whatever happened on the seam tonight would happen unobserved and unrecorded except by the instruments he himself controlled. A flush charge through the core's ventilation. Or cleaner, a thermobaric on the structure itself. The moment the storm thinned enough to put a drone up, one drone, one charge, and 9 years of the most expensive problem on the contract solved in a single stroke. With a storm to blame for the structure loss, and a dead human to be very publicly mourned as a tragic casualty of a natural disaster, the wardens had warned her about for 3 seasons. The human, yes, there was the human. Vrel considered the human for rather less time than the problem deserved. She had been a thorn, the refusals to relocate, the soil reports that ran long, the way the exobiology office cited her observations as a reason to keep studying the packs instead of culling them. She had chosen to live in the exclusion zone against all advice. If the storm took the structure, that was her choice coming home. And if the structure happened to be taken by something other than the storm, on the one night in a decade when both packs were inside it, well, the wardens had warned her. He would need authorization. He would not get authorization. The exobiology office would tie it up for a week, and by then the storm would break and the packs would scatter back to their ranges, and the chance would be gone forever. So he would not ask for authorization. He would act under the emergency provisions that a shield breach event placed at a warden-captain's discretion, and he would file the paperwork afterward, when it was a solved problem and not a proposal, and he would be the Sethvin who closed the seam contract, and the 11 dead wardens would be avenged, and the budget would balance, and history would record a warden-captain who had moved decisively in a crisis. He opened a channel to the depot's small cull response cell. 4 wardens, a flush unit, and the 2 hardened drones that could fly in the tail of a shear if they had to. "This is Vrel," he said. "Emergency mobilization, seam breach authority. I need the response cell staged and ready to move on the marrow holding the moment the storm thins to drone tolerance. Full flush kit. We have both target populations denned in a single structure and a weather window closing at dawn." He paused, and added, because he was an efficient Sethvin and liked his logs clean, "Be advised the structure's civilian occupant is presumed lost to the breach. Recovery is not a mission objective." He closed the channel. He did not, at that moment, feel like a cruel Sethvin. He felt like a Sethvin who had waited 2 years for a door to open and had just heard it swing. He did not know that the human he had written off as presumed lost was, at that moment, sitting cross-legged and awake in the center of her shed, humming an old song, holding a truce between 2 armies with the flat of her comm, and that she was, without knowing his name yet, the single most dangerous obstacle to the plans of Warden-Captain Osip Vrel that had ever existed on the seam. The night deepened, and the truce nearly died anyway, and it was not the storm that almost killed it. It was a young Dreno male, and Dell had been watching him for an hour before he moved, because she had learned to watch for exactly this. He lay near the gray mother's flank, big and rangy and not yet full-grown, and he had never settled the way the rest had settled. All night the others had lain with their eyes half shut, and their bodies eased against the warmth. This one lay coiled, his eyes open and fixed across the line at the corvatch, his lip trembling on the edge of a snarl every time the ridge smell shifted. He was young enough to still believe that the thing that made you strong was refusing to lie down. He was young enough not to understand yet what the old female understood, that the storm was the enemy tonight, not the corner, and that lying down in your enemy's smell to outlast the cold was not weakness, but the hardest kind of strength. He rose in the coldest part of the night, when even the gray mother's eyes had finally begun to droop, and he stalked the line. Dell came upright against the core the instant he moved, because she felt the change before she saw it, a stiffening that ran through the whole Drano side. A waking, the pack coming up out of sleep to the knowledge that one of their own was about to do a thing that would get them all killed. The young male walked the 2-meter line with his head low and his hackles up and his whole young body singing with the need to prove something. And across the line the ridge queen came awake and rose over her cub with her mane lifting, 40 barbs standing, and the thing Dell had held all night began, for the first time, to come apart from the inside. She could not stop it the way she'd stopped the others. This was not 2 packs colliding. This was one animal choosing, and you could not tell a choosing animal to be easy the way you told a frightened one. Dell was on her feet and moving before she decided to, into the line, into the narrow space the young male was stalking, and she put her body between him and the queen, which was the most dangerous thing she had done all night, because a Drano and a challenge fury did not always see what was in front of it, and she was soft and slow and directly in his path. "Hey," she said, low, flat, not a plea. "No, not you, lie down." He did not lie down. He checked a half step, his amber eyes coming to her, the human standing in his way, and for a heartbeat she saw him weigh it, saw the young animal calculation of whether the small warm biped was part of the thing he was challenging or an obstacle to go through, and she held absolutely still and absolutely calm and let him look at her, and did not give him a threat to answer. Behind her she could feel the queen's heat, the queen's fury, the cub. In front of her the young male's lip peeled off his teeth, and a growl came up out of him aimed past her at his enemy, and he gathered his weight to come. Scrap hit him first. Dell never saw exactly how it happened, only that a gray shape came off the wall at her side and put itself between her and the young male, and it was Scrap, her splash-blazed yearling, smaller than the hothead and younger, and he did not attack the older male so much as insert himself, shoulder to the challenger's chest, and make a sound Dell had never heard him make, a hard, flat bark once with his own hackles up at one of his own pack, taking her side, telling the older male in the only language he had that the human was not to be gone through, that this ground was held, that whatever the young male thought he was proving he was not going to prove it here, not through her, not while Scrap stood. It was not enough on its own. Scrap was a yearling. But it was enough to buy the half-second it took for the gray mother to reach them. The old female came off her place at the core like something 20 years younger, and she did not bark and she did not posture. She took the young male by the scruff, the way you take a pup, and she slammed him down onto the plating so hard the whole shed rang, and she stood over him with her scarred muzzle against his throat and held him there, pinned, shaking, while a sound came out of her that needed no translation in any species, the low grinding fury of an alpha whose authority has been defied at the worst possible moment, telling a young fool exactly how close he had come to killing his whole pack, and exactly what she would do to him if he moved again. He did not move again. He lay under his alpha's jaws with his eyes rolled white and his young body gone limp in surrender, and the gray mother held him there a long moment. And then, deliberately, she turned her head and looked at Dell, at the human standing in the line, unhurt, unmoved, and then at the ridge queen over her lifted cub, and she made the fury sound once more, low at both of them, at the whole room, an old female laying down the law of her house in another creature's house. Not here. Not tonight. Nobody breaks it. And she let the young male up, and he slunk to the farthest corner of the Drano side with his tail clamped, and did not lift his eyes again, and the Gray Mother went back to her place at the core and lay down, and across the line the Ridge Queen let her terrible mane go down, barb by barb, and gathered her cub and lay back down, and it was over. Dell stood in the middle of the line with her heart slamming and understood what she had just watched. It was not that she had held the truce. It was that the truce had begun to hold itself. The Gray Mother had not disciplined the young male to please the human. She had disciplined him because the peace of the human's ground had become, somewhere in the long night, the pack's own peace to keep, because an alpha who had chosen to lie down on held ground would enforce that choice on her own people rather than see it broken. The human had set the law. The pack had made it theirs. Dell looked at Scrap, who had come back to press against her leg, still stiff, still proud of himself, and she crouched and put her forehead down against his hard young head for just a moment, the closest she had come all night to breaking. "You stood for me," she whispered. "You stood for me against your own. I won't forget that, Scrap, not ever." She straightened. The room had settled deeper than before, the challenge burned out of it, and in its wake something had shifted that she would not fully understand until she saw it with her own eyes a few minutes later, when she looked across the shed in the low lamplight and found, at the very end of the line, where the Dreno side met the Korvach side, two animals lying back to back, a Dreno and a Korvach. Not touching on purpose, neither would ever have admitted to it, but pressed spine to spine in the cold, each taking the other's warmth, each guarding the other's blind side without meaning to. Two enemies who had been driven so far past the edge of what their kinds allowed that they had come out the other side into the oldest thing of all, which was simply two cold animals keeping each other alive in the dark. Dell sat back down against the core and watched them, and hummed very low and did not let herself hope for anything, because hope was dangerous on a frontier. But she watched the two spines press together at the end of the line, and she thought, maybe this doesn't have to only be tonight. The night deepened further. The storm did not break. It settled into a long grinding roar, hour after hour of it, the cold pressing on the walls, the core thumping steady against Dell's spine. She had moved back from the center of the floor by slow degrees, once the cub was warm and the room had quieted, easing an arm's length at a time toward the core wall, until she could lean against the warmth again. And both packs had let her, tracking her the whole way, and she had ended half sitting, half lying in her strip of floor with Scrap pressed warm against her side, and the whole strange armistice of her house breathing around her in the dark. Then, around the coldest hour, the core stuttered. She felt it before she heard the alarm, a hitch in the steady thump against her spine, a half-second silence where the rhythm should have been, and then it caught again, and then it hitched again longer. Dell sat up. The little status panel on the core face had gone from green to a slow pulsing amber, and the number under it, the one that mattered, the internal temperature margin number, had begun, very slowly, to fall. She knew this fault. She had filed 3 reports about this fault. The core's primary intake screened the frozen sedge dust out of the air it drew for combustion, and in a bad blow the dust came faster than the screen could shed it, and the screen iced and clogged, and the core throttled itself down to keep from choking. And if you did not clear the screen, the core throttled itself down and down until it went a standby. And in a standby core in the middle of the whitening, the temperature in the shed would reach killing cold in under an hour. The screen was on the outside of the shed, on the wall, in the storm. Dell sat in the amber light with 2 Apex packs and a warming cub, and did the newest and worst piece of arithmetic of the night. To save every living thing in the shed, including herself, she was going to have to open the door, go out into the whitening, clear an ice screen with her bare hands in a wind that would freeze exposed flesh in minutes, and come back. And she was going to have to do it while leaving 2 hereditary enemy packs alone in a warm box with no human sitting on the line between them. The moment she went out that door, the truce was hers no longer. And the moment the truce broke, there would be nothing to come back to but blood. "Okay," Dell said aloud to the amber light, to the falling number, to the packs, Her voice did not shake. She had a great deal of practice at not letting it. Okay. New problem. She thought it through the way she thought through everything, in order without hurry. Because hurry was how you died on a frontier, and she had not died yet. She could not stay. If she stayed, the core throttled to standby and everything froze, slowly, all of them together. The truce and the Pax and the cub and the human. A whole shed full of the impossible turned to cold meat by dawn. She could not simply crack the door and reach around and hope. The screen was a full arm's length from the door edge, up the wall, and it would need both hands and a scraper and a minute of work. A minute of standing exposed in the whitening with her back to a room full of predators and the wind trying to peel the skin off her face. So she was going out. And the only question that mattered was what she left behind her. Dell looked at the Gray Mother. Then she looked at the Ridge Queen. Then she did the thing that she would never be able to make a warden understand, the thing that Pell, listening on the open channel, would hear and not comprehend until much later, the thing that would eventually go into the exobiology office's files under the driest possible language, and change how three species understood one another. She talked to them, not baby talk, not commands. She talked to them the way she'd have talked to two people she was about to trust with her life, because that was exactly what she was doing. I have to go outside, she said, low and even, looking from one old female to the other. The heater's choking. If I don't clear it, it stops, and if it stops, we all freeze, you, me, the little one, all of it. So I'm going out that door for 1 minute, 1 minute. She held up one finger uselessly and put it down. And while I'm gone, there's nobody sitting on the line, so I need you to do the thing you've done all night. I need you to not. She looked at the Gray Mother. Not. She looked at the Ridge Queen, at the cub tucked against her chest. Not 1 minute. Then I'm back and there's warm and everybody lives. Yeah. Neither animal answered, because they were animals, and Dell was not a fool who thought otherwise. But the Gray Mother's ears were forward, and the Ridge Queen had gone still in the particular listening way she went still. And Dell had spent 3 seasons learning to read the difference between a predator that was about to move and a predator that was waiting, and both of these old killers were waiting. It would have to be enough. The number on the core was still falling. Dell got up slowly, both packs tracking her, and she pulled her cold weather gear off the wall hook, the sealed hood and the heavy gloves and the face mask she wore for the worst of the winter work. And she geared up in the amber light while 30 eyes watched her, and she took the long-handled ice scraper down off its bracket, and she went to the door. Scrap came with her, pressing at her leg, and she crouched and put both gloved hands on his hard young head and said, "No, you stay. You stay warm. Keep an eye on things for me." And she gently pushed him back, and he sat, unhappy, his splash-blazed chest heaving, and let her go. She put her hand on the bar. She looked back once at the whole strange, sheltering house of her enemies and her wards, and she said to all of them, 1 minute, and she lifted the bar and went out into the whitening and pulled the door shut behind her. The cold hit her like a wall going through her. Even geared, even hooded, the wind found every seam and drove the cold into it, and the sedge dust came off the flats in a horizontal blizzard that scoured the exposed skin around her eyes raw in seconds. She could not see the horizon. She could not see the ground. She could barely see the wall of her own shed an arm's length in front of her face. The storm roar was total, a physical pressure on her skull. She got her shoulder against the plating and worked her way along the wall by feel, one glove trailing the metal, to the intake housing, and she found the screen by memory and got the scraper's edge under the ice crust and began, with her whole weight, to clear it. It came in slabs, gray ice packed with dust, and under it the screen was black with clog, and she scraped and dug and clawed at it with the scraper, and then with her gloved fingers, and the wind tried to take the scraper out of her hands, and the cold came up through the gloves into her fingers and began, methodically, to kill them. She could feel the core through the wall, the sick throttled hitch of it, and she scraped, and she thought about nothing at all except the screen, because that was the only way to do a thing like this. You did not think about the door behind you or the packs behind the door or the war that might be starting in your house while you stood out here scraping ice. You thought about the screen, one square of it at a time, until it was clear. It took more than a minute. It took, she would guess later, 4 or 5, though out there with the cold eating her hands it had no length she could measure. And the whole time behind her, through the wall under the storm roar, she strained for the one sound she was afraid of, the landslide sound. The sky before a growl swelling to the thing itself, and it did not come. The shed stayed silent behind her. Whatever was happening in there in the dark with no human on the line, it was not that. The screen came clear. She felt the core catch it, felt the hitch smooth out under her hands, felt the steady thump come back through the plating, strong, hungry, drawing clean air, and she nearly wept with the relief of it. And she got herself back along the wall by feel with her dead hands clamped on the scraper, and she found the door, and she hammered the bar up with the heel of one useless glove, and she fell through into the warm dark and hauled the door shut behind her and dropped the bar and lay against it, gasping. Ice cracking off her gear, and looked up at her house. Nobody was dead. The gray mother lay along the core wall exactly where Dell had left her. The Ridge Queen held the cold corner with her cub against her chest, exactly where Dell had left her. The 2-meter line ran empty between them exactly as it had all night, and every animal in the shed was looking at the door at her, at the human coming back and out of the killing cold with ice in her lashes, and her hands frozen to a tool, and something had changed in the looking. Dell felt it and could not have named it. All night they had watched her the way you watch weather, the way you watch a thing that holds power and might turn it on you. Now they watched her the way you watch one of your own come back from the hunt. She had gone out into the thing that was killing all of them, alone, and cleared it and come back, so that they would live. And 2 apex species that shared almost nothing understood in the marrow of them exactly what that was because it was the oldest thing there was. She had provided. She had gone into the cold for the pack. Both packs. The gray mother rose. Dell went still against the door. The old Dreno crossed the floor to her, crossed her own half of it, came to the edge of the line and stopped, and then deliberately put one paw over the line into the human strip and lowered her scarred white muzzle and pressed it, once, hard against Dell's frozen glove. Then she withdrew, back over the line, back to the core wall and lay down. And the Ridge Queen from the cold corner watched the Dreno do it, and after a long moment she made her low churring sound, the not growl, the almost question, and she nosed her cub out from against her chest and gave it a small push with her paw, out toward the center of the floor, toward the line, and the cub, warm now and steady on its feet, tottered out across the killing ground that no adult of either pack would cross, and toddled up to the human sitting by the door and climbed, with the graceless determination of the very young, into Del Marrow's frozen lap, and curled up there, and went to sleep. Del sat with a Corvetch cub asleep in her lap, and a Dreno's press still warm on her glove, and both ancient enemy packs settled and breathing around her in the dark, and she put her ruined hands very gently around the sleeping cub for the warmth of it, and she did not cry, because she was not a crier, but she came nearer to it than she had in years. "Okay," she whispered to the shed, to the storm, to the impossible thing she was sitting in the middle of. "Okay, we're okay." The storm saved its worst for the hour before it broke, the way storms do, and for a while Dell thought it was going to take the shed down around all of them. She heard it start high in the wind, a new note under the roar, a thin metal shriek that rose and fell, and she knew it the way she knew every sound her house made. The lee-side roof panel, the one she'd flagged twice for a corroded seam and never gotten the parts to fix, had begun to work loose in the shear. She could see it when she looked up, the panel lifting at one corner with each gust, a hand's width, too, cold air knifing through the gap in a white jet that fell straight down onto the Corvetch side of the shed, and with each lift the gap grew, and if a gust caught it full and peeled it back, the storm would be inside the shed with all of them, and the core could not warm a box that was open to the whitening, and everything Dell had held all night would freeze in an hour with the piece still holding. The Pax felt the cold jet and the shriek and did not like it. The corvette shifted under the falling cold, the queen curling tighter over her cub, and a restlessness ran through both sides, the animals reading the shed itself as failing, the shelter turning on them, and Dell understood that if the roof went, it would not just be the cold that killed the truce. Panic would. A pack that believed the ground itself had betrayed it would break for the door, and two packs breaking for one door was the war she'd spent all night stopping. She had to reach the panel. It was 3 meters up, at the joint of the wall and the roof, over the corvette's corner, over the queen, over the cub. And the only way to it was the core frame and the wall brackets she used to service the upper vents, a climb she'd made 100 times in good weather, and never once with a Ridge Queen's territory directly beneath her. "Easy," she said to the whole room, to the shriek and the cold and the 30 tightening bodies. "Easy. I've got it. The house holds. I've got it." And she went to the queen's corner, slow, hands open, into the cold jet, and she crouched in front of the Ridge Queen with the falling storm cold on the back of her neck, and she looked the great animal in her flat gold eyes and said, "I have to go up, right over you, over the little one. I'm not a threat. I'm going to fix the sky. Let me by." The queen could have taken her hand off at the wrist. Dell was crouched inside the reach of the killing claw with a cub between them, the most dangerous place in the shed, asking a corvette to let a human climb over her young in the dark. And the queen held and looked at her, and then gathered her cub in close against the wall and shifted her heavy body a hand's width aside, making room, seating the wall, letting the human pass, and Dell breathed once and went up. She climbed the core frame and the wall brackets in the dark with the cold jet blasting her, and the panel shrieking a hand's breadth from her face, and she got one arm hooked through a bracket and her shoulder under the lifting corner, and she braced it, physically, with her own body, driving the panel back down against its seam with her back and shoulder, while the gusts tried to tear it and her both off the wall. She could not fix it. There was no fixing it in this. No parts, no time. She could only hold it down against the storm with her own weight and wait for the blow to pass, and so that was what she did. She wedged herself into the angle of wall and roof, 3 meters up over a corvette's queen, and she became a part of her own house, one more brace against the whitening, and she held. It went on a long time. Her arms shook and her hooked shoulder went numb and the cold ate at her, and the panel bucked under her back like a live thing. And below her, in the dark, 30 predators of 2 enemy kinds held their places and did not break, because the human had said the house holds, and then had climbed into the sky to make it true, and they could see her up there in the dark holding the storm off them with her own body, and whatever an animal understood of such a thing, both packs understood it enough to stay. The cub beneath her stopped shivering. The queen lay still over it and watched the human up in the angle of the roof, and did not move. And then all at once, the way it does, the gust cycle eased, the shriek fell away, the panel settled, and the worst of the whitening ground on past the holding and began, at last, to spend itself out on the eastern ridges. Dell held a while longer, to be sure, and then she came down the wall on dead arms and half fell the last of it, and caught herself on the core frame, and stood there gasping in the sudden lesser cold with the panel quiet above her, and she turned around to find the Ridge Queen's flat gold eyes a hand's breadth from her own. The queen had risen. She stood over her cub, and she put her broad armored head down slow, until her nose nearly touched the human's chest, and she breathed in the smell of her, the storm on her, the cold, the effort, and she made the churring not growl, the almost question, but lower now and longer, and Dell, exhausted past fear, reached up and laid her shaking hand flat on the great scarred skull between the eyes, the way she'd never dared touch a corvette, and the queen let her. And for a moment the two of them stood like that in the dark of the shed, the human and the Ridge Queen, while the storm died around them. "Yeah," Dell breathed, "I know." "Me too." Outside, the whitening ground on toward dawn, and 40 kilometers away it began, at last, to thin. And a young warden at a relay station felt his board change, and went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. Pell had been listening to her channel for hours. He had heard the door open and the storm roar in and the door shut. He had heard it happen again later, and had nearly climbed out of his chitin with terror until her voice came back, ragged, saying, "Okay, we're okay," and he had not understood any of it and had stopped trying to. He had simply kept the channel open and kept watch and told himself that as long as he could hear her breathing, she was alive, and that was the only mission he had left. Then, in the gray before dawn, a second channel opened on his board that should not have been open, and Pell, who was young and unimportant, and therefore had access to a great many low-level feeds that more important wardens never bothered to monitor, saw the depot's call response cell come live, and stage, and begin to move. He did not understand it at first. The cull cell moving in the tail of a shear made no sense. There was no cull authorized. The whole flats were an emergency. Everyone was supposed to be sheltering. He pulled the cell's routing, the way he pulled everything, out of the same idle competence that had made him log a fault instead of the truth, and he read the destination, and the destination was the Marrow holding, and the mission tag on the routing said flush, target populations, structure expendable, and Pell sat in his tin can at the edge of the world and felt every plate on his body lift at once. Structure expendable. The structure was her shed. The target populations were in her shed, and Pell, who had logged a fault to keep the loud ones away, understood in a rush of sick horror exactly what he had done. He had kept the anomaly quiet from the exobiology office, and the marshal, and everyone who might have wanted to study it or protect it. And he had not kept it quiet from the one Sethvin on the whole contract, who had spent 2 years praying for exactly this, because the raw feed under his fault flag was still there for anyone with a captain's clearance to pull, and someone with a captain's clearance had pulled it. He hailed the cell. "Response cell, this is Seam Relay, say you're tasking. You are not on any board I have, say you're tasking." No answer. The cell was running dark on captain's authority. He hailed the depot duty officer. "Duty, Seam Relay. I have an unlogged cull cell moving on an inhabited structure. I need a marshal on this channel now." The duty officer, sleepy, unbothered, told him the cell was moving under Captain Vrel's seam breach emergency authority, that it was all in order, that a junior warden at a relay should mind his sensors and not the captain's operations. An inhabited structure, Pell said. There's a person in it. There's a human in it. The presumed casualty, the duty officer said, bored, lost to the breach. Captain's already filed it. Mind your sensors, warden. Pell closed the channel. He sat for exactly 2 seconds with the whole weight of the machine he served pressing down on him. The ranks, the procedure, the captain's authority, the filed casualty, the certainty that a junior warden who interfered with a captain's operation would end his short career in a very small room being asked very long questions. Then he opened Dell's channel, and he did the second thing that night that a good warden did not do. "Marrow," he said fast and low. "Dell, listen to me, don't talk, just listen. There's a cull cell inbound to your position, flush kit, 2 hardened drones, and it is not a rescue. Do you understand me?" "Vrel, Captain Vrel," he saw the sensor logs. "He knows both packs are in your shed, and he is coming to gas the structure with everything in it and write you off as storm lost. He's got emergency authority. Nobody at the depot will stop him. I already tried. They are maybe 20 minutes out behind the storm. Dell, are you there? He is coming to kill everything in that shed, and that includes you, and it is on me, because I logged it as a fault and he pulled the raw feed, and I am so, Dell, what do I do? Tell me what to do." In the shed, in the gray first light leaking through the poly window, Dell Marrow sat with a sleeping cub in her lap and 2 packs breathing around her, and listened to a young warden 30 seasons her junior in nothing but courage tell her that a Sethvin captain was coming to murder the most extraordinary thing she had ever been part of, and she felt something move in her chest that was not fear. It had been a long time since anyone had come at her with something she could actually be angry about. The storm was not anyone's fault. The cold was not anyone's fault, but a Sethvin in a heated office deciding to gas a shed full of exhausted animals and one human because it balanced his budget. That was a decision, and a decision had a person behind it, and a person could be told no. She did not wake the cub. She lifted it gently with her ruined hands and set it down against the Ridge Queen's flank, and the Queen gathered it in without waking, and Dell stood up in the middle of her house slow, so the packs would not surge, and both packs came up anyway, sensing the change in her, the new thing in the set of her shoulders, and this time she did not tell them to be easy. "Pell," she said, into the handset, in a voice he had never heard her use. "How long?" 15 minutes, maybe less. The storm's thinning fast now, Dell. You have to get out, you have to run. There's a service tunnel under the north side, the old drainage. If you go now you can be clear before. "I'm not running, Pell." "Dell, listen to me." She looked around the shed, at the gray mother risen and watching, at the Ridge Queen risen with her cub against her flank, at Scrap standing rigid at her side with his splash blaze and his young shoulders, at all of them, the whole impossible truce, 30 apex predators who had chosen not to kill each other in her house because she had asked them not to. "I've got something out here your Captain Vrel doesn't understand," she said. "I've had it since sundown, and I've been trying to keep it quiet because quiet's what it needed. It doesn't need quiet anymore." She looked at the door, at the thinning storm beyond it, at the gray dawn and the thing coming through it. "You just make sure somebody with a rank higher than his is watching the seam sensors in 15 minutes, she said. "Somebody who can see what's on my grid point. Because I think your captain's about to find out exactly what he's flying into, and I'd hate for there to be no witnesses." She lowered the handset. She looked at her packs. And Del Marrow, Soil Tech, 26 years old, alone on the worst ground on the contract with the dawn coming up and a killer coming with it, felt the last of the fear go out of her and something old and level take its place. And she said, to the two packs who had spent all night learning that she held the ground, "All right, new problem, and this one's not the weather." The storm broke the way frontier storms always broke. Not gently, not by degrees, but all at once, the whitening tearing itself apart on the eastern ridges and the wind falling out of the sky in the space of a few minutes, leaving behind it a flat gray stunned silence and a world scoured white and a cold, clean, killing stillness where the roar had been. In that silence, Del heard the drones coming. They came in low and hard, two of them. The heavy hunched cull drones the wardens only flew in the worst conditions, engine note dropping and rising as they fought the last of the shear, and behind them, further out, the whine of a ground hauler grinding up the service track toward the holding. Del stood in the open doorway of her shed with the dead flats spread white around her and watched them come, and behind her, in the warm dark, 30 predators watched the sky through the open door and made no sound at all. She had thought about how to do this in the 15 minutes she'd had. She had thought about staying inside, barring the door, making Vrel breach it. She had decided against it. A barred door was a target. A barred door was a thing you gassed from the outside without ever having to look at what was inside. No. If she was going to stop a Sethvin captain from murdering her house, she was going to have to make him look at it. She was going to have to make him look at her. So she stood in the open door, in the gray dawn, in the clean cold, an ordinary woman in cold weather gear with her ruined hands bare at her sides, and she waited to be seen. The drones saw her first. They flared and hung, 40 meters out, 30 up, their sensor clusters swiveling, and she knew that in a hauler somewhere behind them Ossik Vrel was looking at a feed of a human standing alive and upright in a doorway that was supposed to contain a presumed casualty. And she knew that the neat story he had filed, storm lost, tragic, warned, had just developed a very inconvenient hole. She lifted one bare hand, slowly, and did not wave, did not plead, only held it up, palm out, the way you tell a thing to stop. The hauler ground to a halt at the edge of the yard. Its rear ramp dropped. 4 wardens came out of it in hardened cold gear with flush units slung and short barb carbines across their chests, and they spread into a loose line facing the shed the way trained wardens spread. And behind them, last, unhurried, came a fifth Sethvin, taller, his gear marked with a captain's bands, and he stopped at the center of his line and looked across 40 meters of white ground at the human in the doorway. And Del looked back at Warden-Captain Osik Vrel for the first time. "You're supposed to be dead," he said. His translator carried it flat across the cold. He did not sound cruel. He sounded like a man reading a figure that had come out wrong. "The structure was breached. You were logged as lost." "You logged me as lost," Del said. "That's different from being lost." "You want to fix your paperwork, Captain? I'm right here." A pause. The drones hung. The wardens held their line. Del could see them now as individuals, young ones, mostly, the kind you sent on a cull, their plates tight with cold and nerves, and one older one on the left flank whose carbine hung a little lower than the others. A Sethvin who had been doing this a long time and had learned somewhere along the way to be careful. That one was looking past Del, at the dark of the doorway behind her, and Del saw the moment his plates lifted, saw him understand what he was looking at, and she filed him away. "Step away from the structure," Vrel said. "Walk to the hauler. You have been through an ordeal. You are not thinking clearly. There are procedures. Step away and this becomes a rescue, and everything is very simple." And then you gas the shed. The silence that followed was its own answer. "Yeah," Del said. "I know what you're here for, Captain. I've known since before you cleared the ridge. You've got both packs in one place for the first time in 9 years, and you're going to solve your whole problem in one morning and blame the storm. And I'm the only witness, so I was supposed to already be dead." She shook her head slowly. "You should have checked. You wrote the ending before you looked in the box." Vrel's plates shifted. When he spoke again, the flat reason had a thin edge under it. "You have been living with vermin so long you have forgotten what they are," he said. "Those animals have killed 11 of my people. They have cost this contract 9 years and more resources than you will earn in a lifetime. Whatever arrangement you believe you have with them, whatever you think happened in their last night, it is a starving animal tolerating a food source in a storm. It ends the moment the storm ends. It has ended. Step away and let me finish a job that should have been finished before you were born." "Come look," Del said. "What?" "Come look." She did not move from the door. "You want to gas them, you should at least know what you're gassing. You've spent 2 years hating a thing on a sensor board. Come to the door, Captain, and look at it with your own eyes, and if you still want to flush the shed after that, well." She spread her ruined hands. "I can't stop 4 carbines. But you're going to do it looking at what you're doing. You're not going to do it off a feed from 40 meters. Not while I'm standing here." It was, she would think later, the single most dangerous thing she had ever said because it worked. Because Osik Vrel was a proud Sethvin and a certain one, and could not stand to be told there was something he had not looked at, and he came. He told his line to hold. He walked across the white ground alone, unhurried, a captain who had faced worse than a stubborn human, and he stopped 2 meters from the doorway, a careful distance, his hand near his sidearm, and he leaned to look past Del Marrow into the warm dark of the shed. Del watched his face. She watched the exact moment the story he had told himself came apart. Because it was not in the dark of the shed, a huddle of starving animals tolerating a food source. It was 2 full Apex packs, Dreno and Korvach, the 2 populations the entire shield line existed to keep 1,000 meters apart, lying in the same 6x4 room in the gray light, settled, breathing, a warm cub asleep against a ridge queen's flank, a scarred old Dreno mother with her chin on her paws, 30 pairs of predator eyes turning as one to the Sethvin in the doorway, and not one of them moving, not one of them lunging, all of them holding. Because the human stood in the door and had not told them otherwise. Vrel made a sound. It was a small sound, and he would have denied making it. His hand had gone tight on the frame of his sidearm, and along his spine every plate had stood straight up, and he was looking at a thing that his entire understanding of the world said could not exist, could not. Two apex populations denned together in calm and ordered around a single small, unarmed biped. And his mouth worked and nothing came out of it for a moment. And Dell let him have the moment, because she needed him to have it. "That's not tolerating a food source, Captain," she said quietly. "You know it isn't. You've watched these animals for 2 years. You know what they do when they meet. Look at them not doing it. Ask yourself why." "This is," Vrel's translator caught, restarted. "This is not possible. It's been happening in my shed all night. Your sensors have it. Your junior warden logged it as a fault because he couldn't believe it either, and you pulled the raw feed and you believed it enough to come kill it. So let's not pretend you think it's a malfunction." Dell held his eyes. "You came here to gas 2 dumb animals in a box. That's not what's in the box. What's in the box is the first time in the history of this contract that the Dreno and the Korvach have shared ground without blood, and the only reason it's holding is standing in this doorway, and you flew out here to kill her. So." She kept her voice flat, easy, the voice she used on the core and the soil and the storm. "Now that you've looked, do you still want to do it?" For one moment, one real moment, and Dell saw it, the answer wavered. Something behind the captain's certainty flickered. Some part of him that was a scientist before he was an accountant. Some part that understood he was standing in front of the discovery of a lifetime with a flush unit in his hand. If he had been a slightly different Sethvin, the story would have ended there in the doorway, with a captain lowering his weapon. He was not a slightly different Sethvin. The flicker passed, and behind it Dell watched the other thing come up, the thing she had been afraid of, because a proud man shown that he has been wrong in front of witnesses does not always choose to stop being wrong. Sometimes he chooses to make the wrong true by force, because that is easier than being small. "No," Vrel said, and his voice had gone cold and final. "No. Whatever this is, it changes nothing. 2 packs in one place is not a discovery, it is an opportunity, the opportunity I came for. If they will die together, so much the better, it saves a second operation." He stepped back, one deliberate step out of the doorway, out of the reach of what was inside it, and his hand came off his sidearm and went to the flush unit at his hip. "You have made your choice by standing there. I will note in the record that the civilian refused evacuation and returned to the structure of her own will. That will have to do." He raised his voice to the line behind him. "Wardens, deploy the flush. Both drones, ventilation intake on my mark. The occupant has declined evacuation." A pause. "Proceed." Nothing happened. Vrel turned. His 4 wardens held their line across the white yard, and not one of them had moved to their flush units, and they were not looking at their captain. They were looking past him, at the doorway, at the dark behind the human, at the 30 pairs of eyes, and their carbines had drifted down, and the older warden on the left flank, the careful one, had taken his hand off his weapon entirely, and was standing very still in the way a Sethvin stands when every instinct it owns is telling it not to attract attention. "Warden-captain," Vrel said, "I gave an order." "Captain," the old warden said. His translator came out dry and steady. "I have worked this seam for 11 years. I have pulled 3 of those 11 dead out of the sedge myself. I know exactly what those 2 packs are and exactly what they do to each other, and I am looking at them not doing it, and I am telling you with respect that I have never seen anything I understand less in my life, and I am not going to be the one who fires the first shot into it." He looked at Dell, and something passed between the old warden and the human, some acknowledgement across 2 species of a thing too large for either of them. "There's a person in that door, Captain," Kess said. "And there's something behind her I don't have a word for, and you want me to flush the whole thing on a storm morning with no marshal on the channel and no authorization anybody's seen. No, court-martial me if you want. I'll take the room." The other 3 wardens did not move either. They were young, and they were frightened, and their captain had just been refused to his face by the oldest and steadiest Sethvin on the line, and none of them wanted to be the one who did what Kest would not. And that was the moment Dell saw it coming. saw the whole shape of it a half-second before it happened, and could do nothing to stop it. That was the moment Osip Vrel, a proud captain publicly refused by his own line in front of a human and a shed full of vermin, made the worst decision of his career. He drew his sidearm, and he did it himself. He turned back toward the doorway, and he brought the weapon up, not toward the Pax, toward Dell, toward the human standing in the door who was the reason his line had frozen, and his certainty had cracked, and his neat morning had come apart. As if killing her would put the story back the way he had written it. As if with the witness gone the thing in the shed would become again the simple animal problem he needed it to be. Dell saw the muzzle come up and level on her chest, and she had time to think, with the flat clarity that had carried her through every bad moment of her life, well, and no more than that. Vrel fired. He was rattled and his hand was cold, and the shot went where a rattled cold hand shot goes, not center, high and wide, the bar brown tearing along the outside of Dell's upper arm, through the gear and the meat beneath it, a hot line of pain and a spray of red across the white doorframe, spinning her half around against the door. She did not fall. She caught herself on the frame and she felt the blood come warm down her arm, and she heard, behind her, in the shed, in the warm dark, the sound she had spent all night keeping from happening. The landslide, the sky before a growl, and then the growl. Because the human had bled, on her own ground, in her own door. And 30 predators who had spent a whole night learning that this small, warm biped held the ground and provided for the pack, and went into the killing cold for them, and was not to be touched. 30 predators of 2 enemy kinds who had not agreed on anything in 1,000 years. Agreed, in a single instant, in the oldest voice there is, on exactly one thing. Both packs came off the floor as one, and came through the door. Warden-captain had 11 years on the seam, and he would tell it afterward, to anyone who would listen, exactly the way he saw it, because he decided in the telling of it that the truth deserved better than the record Vrel had tried to make of it. He saw the captain fire. He saw the human spin against the doorframe with red across her arm and the white paint. And then he saw the shed empty itself into the yard. He had seen Drano hunt. He had seen Korvach ambush. He had, in 11 years, seen very nearly everything the seam had to show, and he had never seen the two of them move together, and the sight of it stopped the breath in him. They came out of the door in a single gray and dark flood, the 2 packs pouring around the wounded human like water around a stone, not one of them so much as brushing her, and they came across the 40 meters of white ground at the warden's line faster than Kest's mind could make sense of, low and terrible and utterly silent now. The growl spent, nothing left but the running. Kest did not raise his carbine. He had already decided he would not, and now, watching 30 apex predators cross open ground as one animal, he understood how little his carbine would have mattered if he had. He did the only sane thing a Sethvin could do in the path of that. He dropped flat, arms over his head plates, and made himself small, and stayed absolutely still. The 3 young wardens broke. Of course they broke. Anyone would have broken. 2 of them ran for the hauler, and the 3rd stood frozen with his carbine half raised and never fired it, and the packs went past all 3 of them like the young Sethvin were furniture. That was the thing Kest could never make the ones who hadn't been there understand. The packs did not touch the wardens. They did not touch the ones who ran, or the one who froze or Kest flat on the ground with his hands over his head. 30 predators driven to fury by the blood of the one they had chosen, and they poured through a line of the beings who had hunted them for 9 years, and they harmed none of them, because none of them was the one. They wanted the one, and the one was standing in the center of the yard with his sidearm still in his hand, staring at the thing he had unleashed, and Osip Vrel had exactly long enough to understand that he had made a terrible mistake before the Ridge Queen reached him. She hit him low, the way Korvach hit, a mountain of dark muscle taking his legs out from under him, and the captain went down into the frozen sedge with the queen's weight across his chest and her broad armored head over his throat and her killing claw. the single-hooked dewclaw that could open a warden's cold gear like foil, laid flat and cold and deliberate against the plates of his neck. His sidearm was gone, knocked spinning across the ice by a dreno that had veered in and struck it from his hand without breaking stride. He lay on his back in the snow with a Corvetch queen's, jaws a finger's width from his throat and 30 predators closing into a ring around him, and he did not move, because there was nothing left in the world for him to do but not move. Around him the packs made the ring. Kest, flat on the ground 8 meters away, watched it form and knew he was watching something no Sethvin had ever seen. Dreno and Corvetch, shoulder to shoulder, no line between them now, no seam, no 1,000 years of blood, just a single closing wall of teeth and muscle around the being who had spilled the blood of the one they held. And every one of them was looking down at Ossik Vrel, with the flat patient attention of predators who have brought a thing to ground and are waiting only to be told what comes next. They were waiting. That was the part that undid Kest entirely. They had him. The queen could have opened his throat in the time it took to blink. Any of them could have, and they were waiting. And Kest understood, lying in the snow, what they were waiting for, and he turned his head slowly toward the shed, toward the doorway, toward the human. Del came off the door frame. She came out into the yard with her arm bleeding and her face gray with the shock of the wound, and she walked, unhurried, across the white ground toward the ring of her packs, and the ring opened for her, predators shouldering aside to make her a path the way courtiers make way for the thing that owns them. And she walked through the gap they made and into the center of it, and looked down at warden-captain Ossik Vrel pinned in the snow with a queen's claw at his throat. He looked up at her. Whatever was in a Sethvin's face, whatever passed for it, Kest saw it break on his captains, all the certainty and all the pride gone out of it, and what was left was a person about to die who had just understood, far too late, everything he had refused to understand in the doorway. "Do it," he said. His translator came out cracked and small. You've won, whatever this is. Do it and be done." And Del Marrow looked down at the man who had flown out through a killing storm to gas her and her packs and write her off as weather, the man who had shot her in her own doorway to keep his story tidy. And she was as close in that moment to hating a living thing as she had ever been. And she had, waiting on her word, 30 apex predators who would open his throat the instant she gave them the smallest sign. She crouched down beside him instead. Slowly, because her arm hurt and because sudden movement was dangerous now, and she put her good hand, gently, the way she had laid it on Scrap's head, the way she had cupped the sleeping cub. She put her good hand flat on the broad armored skull of the Ridge Queen, between the flat gold eyes, over the killing claw at the captain's throat, and she said, in the quiet flat voice she used for the core and the soil and the storm, the voice of the one creature in the yard who was not afraid. "Leave it." The queen did not move. "Leave it," Del said again, soft, her hand steady on the great head. "He's not worth the cold you'd take putting him in the ground. Leave it." For a long, long moment the ring held, 30 predators and a pinned captain and a bleeding woman crouched in the center of it with her hand on a killing beast's skull, and Kest, 8 meters off in the snow, did not breathe. Then the Ridge Queen lifted her killing claw off Ossik Vrel's throat. She did it slowly, watching the human's hand, and she drew back off the captain's chest, and she stood over him one moment more with her flat gold eyes on his, letting him understand exactly how close it had been and exactly whose word had held it, and then she turned her broad back on him. The deepest insult a Corvetch could offer a living thing, to turn her back on it as beneath killing, and she walked to the human's side and stood there, at Del's shoulder, and became still. The ring opened. The Dreno drew back, the Corvetch drew back, and warden-captain Ossik Vrel lay alone and alive in the frozen sedge, untouched, unbulled, spared by the single word of a human he had tried to murder in front of his own line, in front of the seam in front, though he did not yet know it, of a great many people who were watching. He did not get up. For a long moment he did not seem able to. He lay in the snow where 30 predators had pinned him and let him live, and something in the proud architecture of him had come down and would not go back up, and every Sethvin in the yard understood, watching him, that whatever else happened this morning, Ossip Vrel was finished. Not beaten. Beaten he could have survived. He was worse than beaten. He had been spared, in front of witnesses, by the mercy of the thing he had come to exterminate, and there is no recovering a captain's authority from that. Dell straightened up, her hand leaving the queen's head, and swayed a little with the blood loss, and Scrap was there against her leg in an instant, bracing her, and she put her good hand down on his splash-blazed shoulder and steadied herself on him, and looked around the yard at the wreckage of Vrel's tidy morning. The frozen captain, the flat old warden slowly picking himself up out of the snow with his hands spread wide and empty, the young ones huddled at the hauler ramp. The two packs standing easy and mixed and unbothered around a human, as if they had done this every dawn of their lives. "Kest," she said. The old warden looked at her. "That your name, Kest?" "Yes," he said, "Warden Kest." "You didn't fire?" "No," Kest said, "I didn't fire." "Good," Dell said. "Remember it went that way, because your captain's going to want it to have gone some other way, and there were only about 7 of us out here who saw the truth of it, and 30 of them can't testify." She looked down at Vrel, still in the snow. "You'd best get him up before he freezes. Whatever else he is, I didn't stop the queen so the cold could finish the job. Get him warm. Get him in the hauler." And Kest, who had spent 11 years taking orders from captains, found himself taking an order from a bleeding human with a Korvach queen at her shoulder, and finding it the most sensible order he'd had all morning, and he went to do it. That was when the 3rd drone came over the ridge. Not a cull drone. Higher, lighter, marked with the wide bands of a range overseer's office, and behind it, dropping fast out of the clearing sky, the sleek shape of an overseer's flyer, and Dell understood that Pell had done the one thing she'd asked, the only thing that could turn this from a killing into a reckoning. He had gotten someone with rank to watch the seam sensors, and whoever it was had not just watched the sensors. They had come. The flyer set down at the edge of the yard in a spray of white, and its hatch opened, and the Sethvin who climbed out of it wore the deep bands of the highest authority on the whole seam contract, and she stood at the edge of the yard in the gray dawn and looked at the scene laid out across the snow, the human bleeding in the center of 2 mingled packs, the captain being helped up out of the frozen sedge, the flush units unfired, the impossible mixed ring of Drano and Korvach standing easy around it all. And she did not reach for a weapon, and she did not give an order, and for a long moment Range Overseer Hulving simply stood and looked at the thing that could not exist, and let it rearrange everything she knew. Then she walked out into the yard slowly, her hands visible and open at her sides, and both packs turned to watch her come, and did not move, because the human at their center had not told them to, and Hulving stopped a careful distance away and looked at Del Marrow across the trampled snow. "I have been watching your grid point for 20 minutes, the overseer said. Her translator was low and even. A junior warden at the seam relay opened a channel to my office and would not close it. He said a captain was about to fly into something that had never happened before, and that there should be witnesses." She looked around the yard, at the packs, at the Mercy still hanging in the air, at the finished captain in the snow. "I came to see it stopped if I could. I see I need not have hurried." Her gaze came back to Dell, and to the blood on her arm, and something in the set of the overseer's plates changed. "You are hurt." "I've had worse from a fence," Dell said. "It's the captain you'll want to talk to. He's got some paperwork to explain." "Yes," Hulving said very quietly, looking at Vrel. "I imagine he does." Hulving relieved Ossip Vrel of command in the middle of the yard, in the snow, in front of everyone, and she did it without raising her voice, which was somehow worse than if she had. She had him brought to her from the hauler where Kest had put him, and she stood him in the trampled white ground a careful distance from the packs, and she read the emergency authority log off her own handset in a flat, clear voice that carried the unauthorized mobilization, the flush tasking, the structure marked expendable with a civilian inside it, The casualty filed before the storm had even broken. Each line landed, and Vrel stood and took it, because there was nothing to say to any of it that the whole yard had not already watched be true. Then Halving took his captain's bands physically, unclipped them from his gear with her own hand, and folded them and put them in her pocket, and told him he would ride back to the depot in the hold of the hauler he had come out in, and that the inquiry would decide the rest, and that until it did he was to say nothing to anyone. "You do not understand what you are protecting," Vrel said. "It was the last of him, the last of the certainty, and it came out thin. Those animals have killed 11. "I understand exactly what I am watching," Halving said. "I am watching 2 apex packs stand calm around the human you shot. I have watched it for 20 minutes and I do not understand how, but I understand that it is real, and I understand that you flew out here to destroy it before anyone with the authority to protect it could see it. That is the whole of what I need to understand this morning, Warden. The rest is for the inquiry." She turned her back on him. Del noted dryly that the Sethvin and the Korvetch Queen had that gesture in common, and that was the end of Ossip Vrel's mourning, and very nearly the end of him. Then Halving came to Del and looked at her arm, which had gone through gray into a colorless kind of white, and said, "You need that seen to. I have a medic on the flyer. Will they?" She hesitated, looking at the packs, at the ring of them still standing easy around the human. "Will they let a Sethvin approach you?" "If I say so," Del said. "Mostly, slowly. Don't reach for anything on your belt when you come, and don't get between me and the Queen, and tell your medic not to squeak." She looked at the overseer with something that was almost amusement through the gray of the blood loss. "You're taking this very well for a Sethvin. Most of your people would have run by now." "I have wanted to understand these animals for a long time," Halving said simply. "I was told it was impossible to observe them closely, that they could not be approached, that the seam was a place where our kind died. And here you are living on it, and here they are, and you have your hand on the Queen's head." She paused. "I have spent 9 years signing orders about creatures I was told could never be known. I find I would rather understand them than be right about them. Vrel would rather have been right. A beat. That is the difference between us in the end. That is the whole difference." The medic came, slowly, empty-handed, and the packs let the small nervous Sethvin cross the ring under Del's flat steady eye, and Del sat down on the hauler ramp with Scrap pressed warm against her good side, and let the medic clean and seal the barb graze along her arm while 30 predators watched every move the Sethvin made, and the Sethvin's hands shook the entire time, and did the work anyway. It was, Halving said later, one of the bravest things she had ever seen one of her own people do, and she meant the medic, and she also, though she did not say so, meant the human. The wound sealed, the morning brightened, and the cold did not lift. That was the thing nobody had accounted for, the thing that turned the aftermath from an ending into a second, slower problem. The whitening had passed, but the whitening had dragged behind it a killing high-pressure cold, clear and windless and utterly lethal, the kind of cold that came down on the flats after a shear and sat for a day, sometimes 2, before the world warmed enough to live in again. Del knew it well. She had watched it kill a season's worth of feeder hogs one bad winter. And it meant that the packs, exhausted, half-starved, still could not go home. The ranges were a day's run off across open ground that would freeze a running animal solid before it got halfway. The only warm thing on the flats was still the human shed. They were not done sheltering, not by a long way. Del explained this to Halving sitting on the hauler ramp with her arm in a fresh seal, and she watched the overseer understand it, and she watched, a half-second behind, a different Sethvin understand it. One of the young cull wardens, recovered now, standing by the flyer, who heard the human say the packs could not leave and would have to stay through the cold, and looked at 30 exhausted apex predators bedded in and around a shed, and did the arithmetic that a certain kind of mind always does. "Overseer," the young warden said, "if they can't disperse, if they're grounded here another day, then they're grounded. Contained. We could net them. We've got the units on the hauler, both packs cold-slowed in one place. We could take them alive for the exobiology office, study them properly in a facility. We'd never get a chance like. No, Dell said. She did not raise her voice. She did not stand up. She said it the way she had said everything all night, flat and even and final, and every animal in the yard came up off the snow at the change in it, 30 heads turning, and the young warden went very still. They stay free, Dell said. They shelter till the cold lifts and then they go home. That's the whole deal. That's the only deal there's ever been. She looked at the young warden and then at Hulving, and her voice did not rise, but something came into it that made the overseer sit forward. You want to know what happened in my shed last night? I'll tell you every bit of it. I'll tell your exobiology office. I'll draw them pictures. But understand this first, because it's the thing your captain couldn't. What held that truce all night wasn't fear, and it wasn't a facility, and it wasn't nets. It was choice. Both packs chose it. They chose to lie down in their enemy's smell because I asked them to, and because they trusted me not to make them regret it. The second you throw a net over that, you've told every one of them that trusting the human gets you a cage. And then it's over, not just here. Forever. You'll never get it back from either pack, from any human ever. She let that sit. You net them and you don't get a study. You get 30 terrified apex predators who learn the hard way that the calm human was the bait. And the next warden who thinks they can walk the seam because marrow did they die. Because I poisoned it for a report. The yard was silent. Even the packs, sensing the weight of it, had gone still. Let them shelter, Dell said, quieter now. Feed them if you want to do something useful. I've got a hog pen out back. Take what's in it. They're starving. Watch them all you like from a respectful distance. Bring your exobiology people. I'll walk you through every hour of the night. And when the cold lifts, open the yard and let them walk home. And then you'll have something no net ever gets you. You'll have a seam where the human's word holds. And a warden who learns to speak it can walk ground that's killed 11 of you. She looked at Hulving. That's worth more than 2 packs in cages. You know it is. Vrel couldn't see past the budget. Don't be Vrel. Hulving was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned to the young warden. Stand the nets down, she said. Bring the feed from the pen. And get the exobiology office on the channel, the senior one, not the duty clerk. Tell them to come, and tell them to come humble. She looked back at Dell, and there was something in the set of her that had not been there when she landed, a kind of settling, the look of a Sethvin who has decided which side of a line she is going to spend the rest of her career on. You have my word, Marrow. They shelter and they go home free, on the authority of this office, and it will be in writing before the hour is out. A pause. I would like, if you will allow it, to stay and watch, and to have that junior warden brought out here, the one who would not close the channel. Pell. He earned the seeing of it more than any of us. Bring him, Dell said, and something eased in her that had been clenched since sundown. He's the reason there's anybody alive to see. He should get to look at what he saved. So the day became a strange one, a day the seam contract would talk about for years. The killing cold sat down over the flats, clear and blue and lethal, and under it the humans holding became something that had never existed anywhere, a place where 2 apex packs and a slowly growing crowd of Sethvin shared the same patch of frozen ground and did not die of it. Wardens brought the feeder hogs from the pen and set them out at the yard's edge, slow and careful under Dell's direction, and the packs ate, Dreno on one side and Korvetch on the other, with the humans shed between them holding the line the way it had held it all night. And the wardens watched from the flyer and the hauler with their translators recording, and their plates lifted in a permanent low awe. Pell came in on the second flyer an hour later, and he climbed out of it and stood at the edge of the yard staring at the thing he had refused to close a channel on. And Dell walked over to him, slowly, always slowly now, with Scrap at her heel and the Queen tracking her from across the yard. And she stood in front of the young warden who had logged a fault and then defied a captain, and then handed the whole night to the one Sethvin who could save it. And she looked at him for a moment. And then she put out her ruined hand. Junior Warden Pell, she said, I don't think we've met in person. I'm Del. Pell looked at the human's offered hand, and at the Dreno yearling leaning against her leg, and at the Ridge Queen watching from across the yard, and at the whole impossible morning. And something happened to the young Sethvin's plates that in his species meant the thing that in a human would have been tears. I logged it as a fault, he said, wretched. I saw it on the board and I logged it as a fault because I couldn't believe it, and that's how he found it, that's how he... You logged it as a fault to keep the loud ones away, Del said. And when the loud one came anyway, you were the only warden on the whole contract who did something about it. You didn't close the channel. You got Hulving. That's the entire reason any of this is standing here in one piece, including me. She kept her hand out. So, Del. Pell took her hand. His grip was careful and his plates were still doing the thing, and Del shook it once firmly, the way you shake the hand of someone who has earned it, and behind her the Ridge Queen watched a Sethvin touch the human and did not so much as flick an ear, because the human had allowed it, and that was the whole of the law now, on the seam, in the yard, on the ground that Del Marrow held. The exobiology office arrived at midday, 3 of them in a slow, careful flyer, and their senior was an old Sethvin named Seno, who had studied the Dreno and the Korvach for 2 decades entirely through sensor feeds and recovered carcasses, and had never once, in 20 years, seen a living one closer than a long lens allowed. He came out of the flyer and he saw the yard, the 2 packs bedded and fed and mingled, the human moving among them, the wardens watching from a respectful line, and the old scientist stopped dead in the snow and stood there with his instruments hanging forgotten off his shoulder, and simply looked, for a long time, at 20 years of being told a thing was impossible lying asleep in front of him. Then he came and sat with Del on the hauler ramp, humble, the way Hulving had told him to come, and he asked her to tell it and Del told it. All of it, from the beginning. She told him about the wire in the spring, and the yearling with the splash-blazed chest, and the dusk she'd gone out with cutters and cut a young Dreno loose and never reported it. She told him about the Korvach 2 winters back with a warden's barb festering in her shoulder, and the dish of water and the guts of a hog set out at the corner of the shed for 3 dusks, and the pliers and the run. She told him how the gray mother had come to the door first and weighed her and remembered, maybe, the wire. How the Ridge Queen had come second with 1,000 years of blood in the way and stopped in the killing ground because the human held the light. How she had set the kettle on the core and told 2 packs to lie down, and they had. The kettle, Seno said. He had been recording everything, but he stopped at the kettle. Why the kettle? You keep returning to it. What did the kettle do? 2 things, Del said. She had thought about this in the long night, sitting between the packs. One's simple. It's warm and it's water, and the air in a sealed shed with 30 animals breathing goes bad and dry fast, and a kettle boiling puts moisture back and pulls the chill off the floor air. That's just weather. Keeps everybody comfortable, and comfortable animals are calm animals. She paused. But the other thing's the one that matters, and I don't have science for it, so you'll have to take it as a keeper's word. I will take it as a keeper's word, Seno said. I have 20 years of science and none of it predicted this. Tell me the keeper's word. The kettle's a sound, Del said. A steady one. It ticks when it's warming and it sings when it's hot, and it never stops as long as I keep it filled, and it's a sound that means nothing's wrong. Nothing hunts to a kettle. Nothing dies to a kettle. It's the sound of a place where somebody's home and calm and going about their evening, and every animal on every world I've ever heard of knows the difference between the sound of calm and the sound of alarm. She looked out at the packs. I kept it singing all night. Every time the room got close to breaking, when the cub came, when I had to go out to the core, I'd get it going again the second I could. Because as long as the kettle was singing, the ground was calm ground, and calm ground is held ground, and you don't spill blood on held ground. They learned it in about an hour. Both packs. The kettle sings, the truce holds. It got so I think they were listening for it. She shrugged and winced at her arm. That's the keeper's word. Believe what you want. Seno was quiet for a while. Then he said softly, 20 years and the thing I could not learn from a lens you learned from a kettle. He shook his head slowly. There is a paper in this that will change my entire field, but there is something larger than the paper and I think the overseer already sees it. May I? He glanced at Hulvin, who had come to stand near, listening. This should not be only a paper. This should be policy. Yes, Hulvin said. It should. She looked at Dell. For 9 years this office has kept the seam shield line running to hold these two populations apart, at ruinous cost, because the alternative was the killing you saw the storm nearly cause and Vrel tried to cause. And the whole time the answer to it was living on top of the shield line, keeping a kettle, not a wall between them, a ground between them held calm by someone both packs trust. She turned to Seno and to the wardens, and Dell realized the overseer had gathered the whole yard to hear this, that this was a thing being decided out loud in the open in front of the packs on purpose. There is a concept in old Sethvin law, Hulvin said. Hearthright. Ground a family holds is peace ground. You do not carry a feud across another's threshold. We abandoned it when we came to the frontier because the frontier had no hearths worth the name. She looked at the human shed, the battered core, the tin kettle on its shelf visible through the open door. I think we found one. I think we should give it back its old name in a new form, and I think we should write it into the range law of this contract before the sun sets, so that no captain can ever again do what Vrel did today. What would you call it? Seno asked. Hulvin looked at Dell, and Dell, who had never wanted to name anything, who had spent 3 seasons not naming the packs out loud where a warden could hear, looked at the shed and the kettle and the ground she'd held all night, and said the only thing that fit. Kettle ground, she said. Call it kettle ground. Ground a human holds calm. Where the kettle's on, nobody carries the feud across the door, not the packs, not you, not anybody, and nobody culls what's sheltering on it, ever. It went quiet in the yard. And then old Seno, the scientist, said the thing that made it real, made it more than a phrase, because he was the one with 20 years of authority to say it. That is precise. That is exactly precise. It is not taming, she has tamed nothing, the packs are wild and will stay wild. It is not command, she cannot make them do anything they do not choose. It is neutral ground under a trusted holder, recognized by both parties, enforced by the holder's calm. Kettle ground. He said it again, tasting it, and then he began, right there on the ramp, to write it into the record in the flat, permanent language of his office. And Dell watched a thing she had done half frozen in the dark become law. But Hulvin, who was a careful Sethvin, said what the careful ones always say. The inquiry will contest it. Vrel has allies at the depot who have wanted the cull as long as he has. They will say a human's word is not a thing you can build law on. They will say what happened here was a fluke of the storm, that it will not hold when the weather is fine and the packs are fed and there is no cold to drive them together. They will want proof it is real and not desperation. She looked at Dell. Can you give them that? Can you show them it holds when it does not have to? Dell thought about it. And then she stood up off the ramp slowly, both packs coming up as they always did, and she walked out into the middle of the yard, into the open, into the trampled snow between the Dreno bedded on one side and the Korvach bedded on the other. And she stood in the center of the seam that had killed 11 wardens, and she called them. Not with fear driving them, not with a storm at their backs. In the clear, bright, killing cold of a calm midday, fed and rested, with nothing forcing anything, Del Marrow stood in the open ground and said in her flat, easy voice, "Come here. Both of you, come on." The Grey Mother rose from the Dreno side and came to her. The Ridge Queen rose from the Korvach side and came to her. They came from opposite ends of the yard, 2 apex alphas of 2 enemy kinds, across open ground, in no storm, under no cold pressure, driven by nothing at all but 3 seasons of a human's small, stubborn mercies and 1 long night of trust. And they met at the human, one at each of her shoulders, the scarred old Dreno and the armored Ridge Queen, close enough to kill each other in a heartbeat. And they stood there at Dell's shoulders in the sight of every Sethvin in the yard. and they did not kill each other. They stood, calm, flanking the human, and looked out at the watching wardens together, as if the two of them holding a truce at a human's side were the most ordinary thing in the world. Old Senno made a low sound. Halvin went very still. And every warden in the yard understood, all at once and past all argument, that it was real, that it was not the storm and not the cold and not desperation, that it was a thing the human had built with her own patient hands out of 2 mercies and a kettle, and that it would hold in fair weather and foul, because it was not fear. It was choice. And you could build a law on it after all. "There's your proof," Dell said quietly, a hand rising to rest on each great head, the Drenos and the Korvaches at her shoulders. "Now write it down so nobody has to bleed for it twice." The cold did not lift that day or that night. It sat down over the flats hard and clear and lethal, exactly as Dell had said it would, and so the sheltering went on a second night, and this one nothing like the first. The warden set up a watch post at the yard's edge, a heated shelter for the observers, and old Senno would not leave it, would not sleep, sat at its window the whole night with his instruments and his eyes and recorded everything, and what he recorded was a calm. The desperation was gone. The first night the packs had shared the shed because the alternative was death, and the truce had ridden on a knife's edge the whole way, and Dell had held it with her body in the killing ground and her voice on the line. The second night they shared it because it was warm and because they had done it once already and lived, and the knife's edge was gone. Dell did not sit in the center of the floor. She did not have to. She sat against the core in her own strip, and the packs settled around her, Dreno along the warm wall and Korvach in the corner, and the 2-meter line still ran between them, but nobody watched it anymore. And somewhere in the deep of the night Del Marrow did a thing she had not done in a night and a day. She slept. She woke once, near the coldest hour, and the shed was warm and the kettle was ticking where she'd left it filled and low, and she was not alone in her strip of floor. Scrap was pressed along her one side, as he'd been all night. And against her other side, warm and heavy and slow breathing, was the Korvach cub, and beyond the cub, closer than any Korvach had come to her all night, lay the Ridge Queen, not in her corner but here, against the core wall on the Drano side of the line, with her cub tucked between her body and the humans, and the gray mother lay an arm's length off and did not object, and the line was simply gone. There was no Drano side and no Korvach side. There was the warm wall and the human and the pack, one pack. For one night, in one shed, on one small patch of held ground, there was only the one pack, and the human was in the middle of it, and Dell lay in the warm dark with a Drano yearling on one side and a Korvach queen and her cub on the other, and old Senno weeping quietly at his window across the yard because he understood, better than anyone alive, exactly what he was looking at. She went back to sleep. It seemed the only reasonable thing to do. Word came from the depot the next morning, over Hulvin's channel, and it was what Hulvin had warned it would be. Vrel's allies had moved fast. There was a faction on the contract board arguing that the whole event was a storm fluke and a rogue captain's overreach, and that the sensible response was still, quietly, a coordinated cull now that the exobiology office had confirmed both packs could be found in one place, that the humans' arrangement was a dangerous distraction, and that no serious contract could set policy on the word of a soil tech and a kettle. They had the votes to bury kettle ground in committee, maybe. They did not have Senno's filing yet, and they did not have the thing Senno's filing was going to do to them, and they did not, above all, have any idea what the second night's recordings showed. Hulvin brought it to Dell plainly because she had decided somewhere in the last day that this human was owed plainness. "They will fight it," the overseer said. "They may win for a season in committee, but Senno's filing goes in today, and it is the most complete close observation record of these species that has ever existed, and it exists only because of what you built. And the record does not say the human tamed them or commanded them or controlled them. It says they chose. Twice. In a storm and out of it. That is a very hard thing to vote against, once it is written down, once people have seen the recordings. I think we lose the first vote and win the year." She paused. "But I will not lie to you. There will be pressure to relocate you off the seam, to move kettle ground somewhere the packs are not, somewhere safe, somewhere it is only a paper. You will be offered a great deal to leave this holding." "I know," Dell said. She was watching the packs eat the last of the hogs at the yard's edge, Drano and Korvach, easy now, the cub tumbling underfoot of both. "They've been trying to move me for 3 seasons. Answer's the same as it's always been." "Which is?" "Somebody's got to keep the kettle on," Dell said. The cold lifted on the 3rd day. Dell felt it in the air before the instruments called it, a softening, a give, the killing clarity of the high-pressure cold breaking up into something a running animal could survive. The packs felt it too. There was a change in them through the morning, a restlessness. The Dreno drifting toward the north edge of the yard and the Korvach toward the ridge side. The mingling of 2 nights slowly, naturally, pulling apart back into 2 packs with 2 homes. And Dell watched it happen and felt the thing she had known was coming and had not let herself think about. They were going to go home. That was the whole point. That had always been the deal: shelter, and then free, and then home. She had said it to Vrel with her arm bleeding, and she had meant it. Wild things stayed wild. You did not keep them. Keeping them was the thing she had spent the whole night refusing to let anyone do. It did not make the watching of it easy. The gray mother came to her first. The Dreno had gathered at the north edge, restless, ready, and the old scarred female left them and crossed the yard one last time to where Dell stood by her shed, and she stopped in front of the human. And for a moment the two of them, the old Dreno and the young human who had cut a yearling out of a wire and never asked for anything, simply looked at each other. Then the gray mother lowered her white muzzle and pressed it, hard, against Dell's chest over the heart. Once, the same press she had given the frozen glove the first night, but deliberate now, unhurried, a thing done in the clear light on purpose so it could be understood. Then she turned and loped back to her pack, and did not look back, because a Dreno did not look back, and the north pack flowed away across the thawing flats toward their range with the old female running easy at the head of them. Scrap did not go with them. Dell noticed it the way you notice a silence. The Dreno were gone, a gray ribbon dwindling north, and Scrap was still there at her leg, his splash-blazed chest, his young shoulders, looking north after his pack and then up at the human and then north again, torn, a yearling caught between the only 2 homes he had. Dell crouched down in front of him, slow, her arm still stiff in its seal, and she took his hard young head in her good hand the way she had that first night, and she looked at him. "No," she said gently, "not this. You've got a pack, Scrap, that's yours. That's where you belong, out there running, being what you are, not sitting in a yard keeping a soft human company." She turned his head gently north toward the dwindling gray ribbon. "Go on, you can come back. Kettle's always on, but you go be a Dreno first. Go on, go home." He leaned into her hand one moment more. Then he went, turned, and ran, all young speed, north across the thaw after his pack, and Dell stayed crouched in the mud of her yard and watched him catch them, watched the gray ribbon absorb him back into itself, and she let herself feel it, just for a moment, the particular ache of loving a wild thing enough to make it leave. The Ridge Queen was the last. The Korvach had gone to the ridge edge and were waiting, and the Queen came to Dell across the empty yard with her cub trotting at her heel, and she stopped in front of the human, and she did the thing Korvach never did, the thing that was in the Queen's whole kind reserved for one another and never, ever for an outsider. She turned her broad back to the human, but slowly, deliberately, and she looked over her shoulder as she did it, gold eye on the human's face, and Dell understood that this was not the insult it had been to Vrel. This was the opposite. This was a Korvach showing the human her unguarded back, the most defenseless thing she owned in the sight of the open sky, telling her, in the only language the Queen had, that there was nothing left to guard against, that the human was inside the guard now, was pack, was trusted with the throat and the spine and the young. And then she pushed her cub forward, once with her nose toward the human, the way she had pushed it across the killing ground on the first night. And the cub tottered up to Dell and reached up and set its small barbed head against Dell's shin, and held it there. And Dell put her hand down on it gently, and the queen watched and made her low churring knot growl one last time, the almost question that Dell had never been able to answer. "Yeah," Dell said to her softly one last time. "Yeah, go on, I've got the ground, it'll be here." She lifted her hand off the cub. "Take your little one home." The queen chirred once more, and gathered her cub and turned, and ran for the ridges with the Corvatch pouring away behind her, dark shapes flowing up into the broken country where no warden had ever walked and lived. And Del Marrow stood alone in the mud of her thawing yard with her stiff arm and her quiet shed and watched the last of them go. Both packs, two ribbons unspooling in two directions across the flats toward two homes, and the seam between them, for the first time in 1,000 years. Holding without a wall. Behind her in the shed, the kettle had gone quiet. She went in and filled it and set it on the core and turned the plate on, and stood in the doorway of her own house listening to it begin, very quietly, to tick. Halvin had said they would lose the first vote and win the year, and she was right on both counts. The contract board buried Kettle ground in committee that first season, exactly as she'd predicted, on exactly the arguments Vrel's allies had loaded. A human's word was not a foundation for law. The storm had been a fluke. You could not run a reclamation on a kettle. The faction that had wanted the cull for 9 years wanted it still, and they had the votes, and for a while it looked as though the whole impossible thing that had happened on the seam would end as it began, as a fault logged and forgotten, a strange night that changed nothing. Then Seno's filing went out across the whole contract, and with it the recordings, and the year turned. Because there is a thing that happens when people who have been afraid of something for a long time watch, with their own eyes, a recording of it lying calm. The wardens saw it first, the ones who'd lost friends to the seam, the ones who'd strung the wire and flown the culls, the 11 times bereaved. They watched the second night's recording, the human asleep in a warm shed with a Dreno yearling on one side and a Corvatch queen and her cub on the other, and the line simply gone, and something moved through the ranks of the grid watch that no committee vote could stop. They had spent 9 years being told the seam could only be held with a wall and a gun. Here was a soil tech holding it with a kettle. And a great many wardens who had never questioned an order in their lives began, quietly, to ask why they were still stringing wire. The year turned on the wardens, and then on the exobiology field, which took Seno's paper and made him, at 60-some, suddenly the most cited scientist on 3 contracts, and then on the budget office, which noticed with great interest that Kettle ground cost the price of 1 human's salary and 1 thermal core against a shield line that cost more every season than the entire rest of the reclamation combined. By the second winter the vote came back around, and this time it was not close. Kettle ground went into the range law of the seam contract in Seno's precise permanent language, neutral ground under a trusted human holder, recognized by both parties, enforced by the holder's calm, no feud carried across the threshold, no cull of what shelters there, the holder's word final on the ground she holds. They decommissioned the seam shield line the following spring. 9 years of the most expensive wall on the contract, powered down and left to the sedge, because it turned out you did not need a wall between the Dreno and the Corvatch. You needed a ground between them that somebody kept calm. The wardens who took the shield line down did it, most of them in a strange reverent quiet, and one of them, Dell heard about it later, and it was the thing that finally made her cry, alone in her shed, where nobody could see. One of them scratched 2 words into the base of the last decommissioned pylon before they hauled it away. Kettle ground, so that whoever came after would know what had stood there and what had replaced it, and that the replacement was better. Ossip Vrel did not go to prison. Dell had half hoped he would and was, in the end, not sorry he didn't, because the thing that happened to him was worse and more just. The inquiry stripped his rank permanently and entered the full record, the unauthorized flush, the expendable structure order, the shot fired at an unarmed civilian in a doorway. The mercy of the packs he'd come to kill spread across every line of it, and then it did not jail him or exile him. It reassigned him to the scene. As a junior warden under the new kettle ground protocols, under the command, ultimately, of the very office he tried to circumvent, on the very ground where 2 packs had spared his life. He worked the scene for the rest of his years, quiet and diminished, and he learned the protocols. And this was the part Dell could never quite make sense of and never entirely stopped watching for. He was good at them. Careful. Steady around the packs in a way the young ones weren't. As if the closest he'd ever come to dying had taught him, too late to be a captain but not too late to be a warden, the difference between a thing you control and a thing you're trusted by. He never spoke to Dell more than the protocols required, but he kept a kettle in his own watch post on the North Line. She noticed that. She never mentioned it. Some things a man has to be allowed to do without being seen to do them. Pell made warden proper that first year, and then made section lead the next, faster than anyone in the history of the depot, on the strength of a night when a junior warden at a relay would not close a channel. He came out to the holding often, at first on business and then on no business at all, and he learned to sit still in the yard while the packs moved around him, and he learned the kettle, and he became, in time, the grid watch's foremost hand at the thing that had no name until Dell gave it one, a warden who could walk seam ground and be let live, because he had learned to speak the human silence. He was not the last. That was the whole point of it in the end, the thing Dell had told the young, net-happy warden in the yard on the first morning. A seam where the human's word held was a seam a warden could learn to walk. And they did learn, one careful warden at a time, and the 11 graves out in the sedge got no new neighbors, season after season, for the first time in the history of the contract. Scrap came back in the autumn. Dell was at the core when she heard the dreno, the particular chorus of the North Pack settling in the yard the way they had taken to doing when the weather turned, and the ground went cold, and kettle ground called them the way it called them now, as a matter of course, a warm way station on the edge of 2 ranges where a pack could lie up out of a blow and know the human would keep the ground. She went to the door and the North Pack was in the yard, and the gray mother was at the head of them, grayer now, slower but running still, and behind her, near the front, bigger than Dell remembered, bigger than he had any right to be, came a dreno with a splash-blazed chest. He was not a yearling anymore. He was very nearly the biggest animal in the pack, deep through the chest and long in the leg, a dreno in his full-grown power. And Dell stood in her doorway and hardly knew him until he came across the yard to her, through the whole pack, past the gray mother, who let him pass and lowered his great head, which now came near to her shoulder, and pressed his blazed chest once against her, the way his mother did, the way he'd first done as a limping, half-starved yearling leaning on her knee. "Scrap," Dell said, and put her hand flat on the top of his head between the ears, where the fur was still, under all that grown muscle, exactly as soft as it had been. Look at you now. Bigger than the whole pack." She looked past him at the gray mother, who watched from the front of her people, old and easy, and Dell understood something about the way the pack had let him pass her to come to the human first, something about rank and succession and who a dreno followed, and she understood that the yearling she had cut out of a wire was going to run the North Pack one day, maybe soon, and that when he did, the North Pack's alpha would be a dreno who had learned, before he learned anything else, that the human's ground was safe ground and the human's word was law, that the truce she'd built in a shed on a storm night was not going to die with the gray mother. It was going to be inherited. The Corvetch cub came back too, that same autumn, grown lean and low and armored, a young Corvetch running near the Ridge Queen's flank, and one bright cold morning both packs were in the yard at once, easy, mingled, the grown yearling and the grown cub playing at the yard's edge the way they had played as babies in the mud 3 seasons gone, and Dell stood in her doorway and watched two apex packs share her ground as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, because now, on the seam, it was. The alarm came again on a gray morning near the third winter, and it was almost the strangest part of the whole strange thing that had become her life, how ordinary it had gotten. Dell was at the core when the breach alarm sounded, the same three descending tones, hollow as a struck pipe, that had cut through the wind 3 years before and told her the shield line had failed. Except there was no shield line now. The alarm that sounded across the grid these days was a weather breach, the storm shield perimeter that still guarded the settlements further out, and when it sounded it did not mean anymore, run and bar the door and pray. It meant a blow was coming, and the packs would come to Kettle ground ahead of it, and the wardens would clear the flats and let them come, and the human would keep the ground, and everyone would live. It had happened twice already. It was becoming a thing the seam simply did. There was a visitor at the holding that morning, a contract auditor from off-world, a high-pale official of some allied species Dell had never met, come to see for herself the famous seam that ran without a wall, skeptical the way people are skeptical of a thing that sounds too neat in a report. She had spent the morning asking Dell sharp questions about enforcement and control and liability, unable to find in her ledgers and her protocols the mechanism that made it work, because there was no mechanism, there was only a human and a kettle, and the auditor did not believe in either. Then the breach alarm sounded, and the packs came. They came out of the north and out of the ridges together, ahead of the weather, two ribbons converging on the holding across the flats the way they had that first storm night, and the auditor came out of the shed white-plated and rigid with the old terror any sane being felt at the sight of an apex pack running. And here were two of them converging, and she reached for a panic she'd carried her whole life, and then she saw the human. Dell had walked out into the yard. She stood in the open ground in her work clothes with her sealed-over scar and her ordinary face, and she did not run, and she did not arm herself, and she did not so much as tense, and the two packs poured into the yard around her, Drano and Korvach, 30-some apex predators of two enemy kinds, and they did not touch her, and they did not touch the frozen auditor at the shed door, and they did not touch each other. They came to Kettle ground ahead of the storm, and they took their places, the Drano drifting to the warm north side, and the Korvach to the ridge side, easy, ordinary, and the grown Drano with the splash-blazed chest came to the human's shoulder on one side, and a lean-grown Korvach came to her shoulder on the other. And Del Marrow stood in the middle of her yard with a storm coming and an apex predator at each shoulder, and looked at the auditor, who was leaning against the shed with one pale hand pressed to her mouth. Unable to speak. "You wanted to see the enforcement mechanism," Del said, mild, over the rising wind. She reached up without hurry and put one hand on the Drano's great head and one on the Korvach's, the two of them holding a truce at her sides that their grandparents had died rather than hold. "This is it. There isn't any other one. There never was." Then she turned and walked back to the shed, and the packs settled to wait out the blow, and she went in past the frozen auditor to the shelf above the core where the battered tin kettle sat, and she filled it, and set it on, and turned the plate on, and in the ringing quiet before the storm the kettle began, very softly, to tick. The auditor found her voice at last. "How?" she said. "How does a person, how do you make them?" "I don't make them do anything," Del said. She didn't turn around. She was watching the kettle warm the way she watched it every morning of her life. That's the part everybody gets wrong going in. Your captain got it wrong, cost him everything. You don't make an apex do anything you can't, and the trying is how you die. The kettle's tick quickened toward a boil, and outside the first hard gust hit the shed, and the packs pressed in against the warm walls to wait it out. And Del Marrow, soil tech, 29 now, alone on the best-known piece of ground on the contract, looked out her narrow window at two apex packs sheltering easy on ground she'd bled to keep calm, and finished it. "You just have to be the one thing in the whole cold world," she said, "that they know will keep the kettle on." The storm came down over the seam, the way it always came, hard and white and killing. And under it, in a warm shed on a seam that no longer needed a wall, a human kept the kettle singing, and two packs that should have been at each other's throats lay down together on held ground and waited for the weather to break. Because they had learned, out of a wire and a barb and a long night and a small stubborn mercy, the one thing that no shield line and no cull and no captain had ever been able to teach them. They had learned whose ground was safe, and they had learned to come home,